What does a soldier hear in the moment before a battle he knows is coming? Not the thunder of guns or the roar of engines, but something quieter, more immediate. The sound of his own breath, perhaps, the creak of canvas webbing, the soft clink of a canteen against his hip, and underneath it all, the ocean. The distant, rhythmic rumble of the English Channel, 3 miles away across the Normandy bocage, carrying the weight of an entire invasion fleet that has been circling and probing the coastline for weeks. It is June 1944, and somewhere in a Norman orchard ringed by centuries-old hedgerows, a company of German Panzergrenadiers is stirring in the pre-dawn darkness, and we are about to spend the next 24 hours walking through their lives, moment by moment, sensation by sensation, to understand what it felt like to be a young soldier caught in one of history's turning points. If you have ever wondered what the actual texture of combat feels like when stripped of spectacle and distilled into the ordinary, the mundane, the human, then I invite you to subscribe for these calm nightly journeys through World War II history. Here, we move slowly through the hours of those who lived through them, finding the forgotten sensory details, the letters they wrote, the fear and boredom that occupied the same hours. The orchard in which the men lie sleeping is not manicured. It is old, its trees gnarled and thick, their trunks wrapped in moss and lichen that has accumulated over more than a century. The grass beneath, what little remains unblemished by boots and rifle butts, is deep with dew, each blade holding a small globe of water that catches what little light filters through the heavy mist rolling in from the west. It is 4 in the morning. The sky above is a featureless grey, neither quite black nor blue, but something in between, and the mist that clings to the ground is so thick that you cannot see more than perhaps 30 or 40 feet in any direction. A soldier standing in this mist, even one accustomed to the cold and damp of northern Europe, would feel as though he were standing inside a cloud itself. The Norman bocage surrounds this orchard on all sides, a landscape unique to this corner of France and Brittany, one that few soldiers in the German army had ever encountered before. The hedgerows rise 10, sometimes 15 feet high, built up over centuries by Norman farmers using earth and stone and generations of careful maintenance. They are not lines, they are walls, thick and living, anchored by hawthorn and oak and elder, their roots running deep, and their branches so densely woven that even in full summer, when the leaves are thickest, a man peering through can see almost nothing on the other side. They divide the landscape into 1,000 small compartments, a green labyrinth, and in this labyrinth, the company has dug in, waiting. The men themselves lie in shallow slit trenches cut beneath the hedgerow's base, or in hastily prepared foxholes in the harder ground beneath the orchard trees. They lie in their uniforms, still damp from yesterday's rain, still caked with the red clay of the French countryside. Some have managed to find a relatively dry spot and have attempted to rest genuinely, their rifles cradled beside them or resting across their chests. Others have not slept at all in what feels like days, and perhaps they have not. Their eyes are open, though whether they are watching or merely staring is impossible to say. The war, for them, has been a thing of waiting and noise and bombardment for weeks now, ever since the invasion began, the constant rumble of aircraft engines, the scream of artillery shells passing overhead, the methodical destruction of the coastline, and the subsequent grinding advance inland, yard by yard, through a terrain that seems designed by nature to resist precisely the kind of swift, mobile warfare that a panzer division was built to execute. The mist carries with it a smell, the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation, the smell of the dew itself, which has a peculiar faint mineral quality in early morning. It carries too the smell of men who have not bathed properly in days, who are wearing the same uniform, eating from the same cans, and whose bodies have begun to accumulate the grime and fatigue of continuous operations. It is not an unpleasant smell exactly, but it is a dense one, a smell that speaks of exhaustion and proximity and the loss of civilian comfort. Somewhere in the mist, a man coughs quietly and then catches himself, as though suddenly aware of the silence, that strange, almost sacred silence that sometimes falls on frontline positions in the hour before dawn, when neither side is actively fighting, but both sides know that fighting will resume soon. Another man quietly strikes a match to light a cigarette, cupping his hands around it, and the small flare of light seems impossibly bright in the darkness, as though he has just lit a torch in a cathedral. The distant rumble of the naval guns has not stopped since the invasion began on June 6th. It is a low, subsonic vibration more than a sound, something you feel in your chest and your stomach, rather than hear with your ears. The bombardment offshore, the continuous effort to interdict German supply lines and reinforce the beachhead, has become such a constant backdrop to life that the silence would be almost shocking. A soldier who has lived for weeks with that rumble as the baseline of his existence might actually feel a moment of disorientation if it suddenly ceased. The rumble is, in a strange way, comforting. It means the Allies are struggling too. They have not broken through completely, and perhaps, just perhaps, the front will stabilize here, in this green maze of hedgerows, before the entire German position in Normandy collapses. But such thoughts are speculation, and the men in the orchard are not thinking in grand strategic terms as the mist deepens around 4:30. They are thinking of smaller things. They are thinking of the smell of their mother's cooking, though that seems increasingly like something from another lifetime, almost like a dream. They are thinking of the ersatz coffee that will be served in perhaps an hour, which will be bitter and weak, but will at least be warm, and warmth matters more than flavor when you are wet and tired. They are thinking of the orders that came down yesterday from the platoon sergeant, orders that spoke of a possible counterattack, a positioning of anti-tank guns, a coordination with the panzer platoon that was supposed to arrive before dawn but has not yet appeared. They are thinking of the friend who took shrapnel in yesterday's bombardment, who was carried off the line by the medics, and who may or may not still be alive. And gradually, almost without anyone consciously marking the transition, the darkness begins to lighten. It is not a sudden thing, not a switch flipping from night to day, but rather a slow increment, almost imperceptible at first. The grey mist that was charcoal becomes a lighter grey, then a grey-blue. The shape of the hedgerow across the orchard begins to define itself more sharply. Branches that were invisible become silhouettes, then acquire dimension. Somewhere, a bird, a blackbird perhaps, or a thrush, offers a tentative note, as though testing whether it is safe to sing. Another bird answers. Within minutes, more birds are singing, and it is one of the strange contradictions of war that the same orchard can play host to this small chorus of avian life, while men lie in the earth below, waiting to kill or be killed. The men begin to stir more consciously now. A hand emerges from beneath a greatcoat and reaches for a rifle that was placed carefully within arm's reach in the night. A man shifts position, his joints creaking, and grimaces at the pain of having spent hours in a cold, damp hole in the ground. Another man sits up more fully and rubs his face with the palms of his hands, as though trying to wipe away the fog of sleep deprivation. There is no bugle, no whistle, no voice shouting orders. Instead, there is a quiet word passed from man to man, a soft Achtung here and there, a sense of collective awareness spreading through the company like ripples in still water. It is time. The darkness is ending. Whatever this day will bring, it will bring it soon. The bocage of Normandy in early June 1944 was a place where the machinery of industrial warfare met the intimate geometry of French farmland. Imagine a landscape composed almost entirely of hedgerows, ancient and densely woven, rising sometimes 8 or 10 feet high, their roots running deep into soil, enriched by centuries of peasant care. These weren't merely decorative features or property boundaries. They were, in effect, a natural fortification system that neither the Allies nor the Germans had fully anticipated in their planning, and yet both would come to depend upon them entirely. It was here, in this green maze of sunken lanes and overgrown copses, that the soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had begun to dig in during those hours just before dawn broke on June 6, 1944. Or perhaps some of them were already positioned when the first reports came crackling through field telephone lines. The unit itself was relatively young as formations went, raised in 1943, composed largely of fanatic Hitler Youth members, many barely out of their teens, mixed with hardened NCOs and officers who had fought on the Eastern Front and returned to train this new generation. It is worth pausing here and asking yourself what it might mean to fight for a cause you have been taught since childhood, surrounded by comrades whose entire worldview has been shaped by a single political mythology. That is neither excuse nor explanation, but context, and context is what historians must hold in mind when they examine the people within the uniform, however troubling that examination becomes. The 12th SS was stationed not far from Caen, roughly 20 kilometers inland from the beaches where the landings were occurring. They were not the first line of defense. That thankless role belonged to the coastal divisions and fortress troops, but they were meant to be the hammer blow, the counter-attack force that would drive the invaders back into the sea. Such were the hopes of German command, at any rate. But by the time these men had received their marching orders and begun moving north toward the sound of the bombardment, something had already shifted in the calculus of the battle. The naval gunfire support for the landings was relentless. The thunder of it travelled inland for miles, a constant percussion that wore on the nerves and seemed to make the very earth restless beneath their feet. The younger soldiers among the Panzergrenadiers, and there were very many of them, had never experienced anything quite like this scale of invasion. Some had been in the Hitler Youth's military formations only a few months before being transferred to frontline units. The Eastern Front veterans among them, the ones with the hard eyes and the economical movements. They knew what industrial warfare looked like. They had seen Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history, just the year before. They understood the weight of superiority in men, machines, and material. So there existed within this single formation a peculiar tension, ideological fervor mixed with battle-hardened skepticism, youth, and enthusiasm tempered by those who had learned, in the mud and blood of Russia, what defeat actually meant. If you were to walk through the bocage, as these men had been doing throughout the night and into the early morning hours, you would find that the terrain itself imposed a kind of order on how war could be fought. The hedgerows meant that large formations couldn't maneuver freely. The lanes between them were often sunken, cut down over centuries by the passage of carts and animals, so that moving through them felt like moving through shallow canyons. Fields were small, rarely more than a few acres, often enclosed on all four sides. This meant that combat in this region would not be the sweeping, fluid warfare of armored columns racing across open steppe. It would be something far more claustrophobic, fought in pieces and fragments, squad against squad, sometimes even closer than that. As the light began to change in the eastern sky, that peculiar grey that comes just before true dawn, the men of the 12th SS were settling into positions throughout the bocage. Some were in hastily prepared foxholes and slit trenches, others crouched in the remains of farmhouses or took position among the thick hedgerows themselves, their rifles and machine guns positioned to cover the narrow lanes. They had ammunition, though never quite as much as they wanted. They had maps, though the maps were not entirely accurate about the local terrain. They had confidence, at least the younger ones did, that their training, their discipline, and their superior German technical expertise would see them through. The veterans said nothing, but smoked their cigarettes and checked their weapons one more time and waited for what they knew would come. The morning mist was still rising from the fields, clinging to the hedgerows, muffling sound. A strange kind of quiet settled over that portion of Normandy, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional mechanical sound of a vehicle engine, and the small human noises of men making themselves ready for a day that would be unlike any they had imagined, even those who thought they had imagined everything. It was June 6, 1944, in the early hours after the largest amphibious invasion in human history had begun, and these young soldiers, some of whom would not see June 7th, others who would carry the weight of these hours for the rest of their lives, were about to step into their part of one of the central events of the 20th century. They did not know, of course, that they would hold their ground here in this green and quiet landscape, that they would fight with a ferocity that would earn them a terrible reputation among their opponents, and that within weeks, many of them would be gone, and the landscape itself would be transformed by the sheer weight of industrial killing. They knew only that they had received their orders, that they had their positions, and that before long they would hear the sounds of combat coming through the bocage toward them, and then they would know whether everything they had been taught and trained for meant anything at all. What made a Panzergrenadier squad function, and how did these small clusters of men, usually numbering between 9 and 13, manage to hold ground against waves of Allied assault across the bocage? The answer lies in a careful, almost meditative anatomy that historians have slowly pieced together through diaries, interrogation records, and the sparse photographs that survived the war. At the apex of each squad stood the Unteroffizier, a rank roughly equivalent to a sergeant, though the German term carried a particular weight of responsibility that transcended simple hierarchy. This man was often older, sometimes in his 30s, and bore the peculiar burden of keeping his younger soldiers alive while executing orders that seemed, by the summer of 1944, increasingly desperate. He would have been through Poland, France, Russia perhaps, the cumulative weight of 4 years of war showing in his face, in the way he moved through the hedgerows with a quietness that spoke of hard-learned survival. Beneath him came the Obergefreiter, a lance corporal of sorts, typically a man in his mid-20s who had shown some combination of reliability and tactical sense. He might command a subsection, or he might simply stand ready to assume the Unteroffizier's role if the next shell or burst of machine gun fire found its mark. The squad's firepower rested on specific tools, each one as familiar to these men as their own hands by 1944. The MG-34, and increasingly the MG-42, served as the squad's organic machine gun, a weapon that could lay down suppressive fire at a rate that sometimes approached 1,200 rounds per minute, a roar so distinctive that Allied soldiers learned to dread its particular song. The gunner himself, typically chosen for steadiness and an intuitive understanding of fire discipline, would occupy a crucial position in any defensive arrangement. Behind him crouched the assistant gunner, whose role involved far more than simple ammunition supply. He was, in effect, an apprentice to violence, learning to read the terrain, to anticipate where enemy fire might come from, and to keep the gun fed with belts of ammunition that could be stripped from captured weapons, from supply runs, or from caches dug into the earth itself. The remainder of the squad carried rifles, predominantly the Karabiner 98 Kurds, a bolt-action weapon that required deliberate aiming and a deliberateness of fire that contrasted sharply with the machine gun's suppressive chatter. One man, often the most conscientious or the youngest recruit, would be designated as the squad's Panzerfaust operator when such weapons became available in 1943 and 1944. This anti-tank rocket, which shot a shaped charge warhead effective against armor at close range, represented an almost sewer-style responsibility. You carried it openly, it was bulky, it marked you immediately as a priority target for enemy snipers and spotters. Yet without it, a squad caught in an open field by a Sherman or a Cromwell had few options beyond prayer or surrender. Consider the practical texture of these men's existence. They were, in the summer of 1944, drawn from several breeding grounds. Some were from the Hitlerjugend, genuinely young men, 17 or 18, who had been raised in Nazi youth organizations and drafted with a kind of ideological fervor that, historians have carefully noted, often proved more fragile under fire than the rhetoric suggested. Others were Wehrmacht transfers, older men who had been conscripted or pressed into Waffen-SS service, men who carried a kind of moral complexity in their posture, a weariness that spoke to questions about choice and compulsion that remain, even in sleep-quiet contemplation, neither simple nor resolved. Still others were ethnic Germans from occupied territories, or even men swept up from occupied France itself, their loyalties a matter of speculation, and, perhaps, internal torment. What unified them, on any given day in the bocage, was not so much ideology as proximity. They slept near one another, fought near one another, and watched one another for signs of breakdown, or fear, or the kind of inattention that could get a man killed. The half-track that ferried them to the line, the SDKFZ 251, a vehicle that would appear again and again in the rhythm of this day, was as much a home as they possessed. Its armoured half-track design, with wheels forward and tracks aft, allowed it to navigate the muddy Normandy lanes with surprising speed, though its canvas-topped rear left the passengers vulnerable to shell fire and strafing. Each man knew the sound of the engine, the particular lurch as it hit a crater or a roadside obstacle, the way it smelled of diesel and hot metal, and their own sweat compounded over hours of riding. The weapons themselves deserved quiet contemplation. The Mauser rifle, solid and reliable, was often issued with a bayonet that doubled as a can opener, a mundane reminder that war, for all its cosmic horror, still involved the simple mechanics of eating and surviving the next minute. The machine gun ammunition came in belts, and a squad that was fighting defensively would calculate, with the precision of the desperate, how many belts they possessed and how long sustained fire would last. Were they 3,000 rounds, 5,000, or merely a few hundred, in which case every burst had to count, and the psychology of rationing became as important as the physics of ballistics. These men understood, too, the topography of fear. A Panzergrenadier squad in 1944 was acutely aware of where the Allies might come from the air, from the hedgerows, from the sunken lanes that seemed to funnel attack. They had learned, through losses that accumulated in the weeks before this particular day in June, that open ground was death, that hedgerows were both blessing and curse, because they hid enemies as readily as they hid defenders, and that the absence of sound sometimes preceded the worst violence. The riflemen carried perhaps 150 rounds each, ammunition they could not easily replace if a supply truck was interdicted by fighter bombers or diverted elsewhere. They carried entrenching tools, smaller than a full shovel, but adequate for scraping foxholes or deepening shell craters. They carried gas masks, though the use of chemical weapons by either side seemed, by this point in the war, unlikely. Nonetheless, the mask remained, a reminder of older fears and older wars. They carried water bottles filled from questionable sources, and some carried letters from home, photographs of fiancés or wives or children they had not seen in months or years. Who were these men, in the deepest sense? That remains a question that historians approach with appropriate caution, knowing that war strips away surface identity and leaves something more primal underneath. Some were conscious believers in the Nazi project, or at least had convinced themselves they were. Others were conscripts, men swept into a system they had not chosen, doing what seemed necessary to survive the moment. Still others existed in some murky middle ground, going through the motions of soldiering while harboring doubts they could not safely voice. They came from towns and villages across Germany, from occupied territories, from backgrounds of poverty or modest comfort, from families that had known peace, or families that had known nothing but war for their entire conscious lives. What they shared, on this night in June, was the knowledge that dawn would come, that the Allies would probe their lines, and that some of them would not see the next night fall. In the darkness before dawn breaks across the Norman bocage, somewhere in a half-ruined farmhouse, whose stone walls have survived centuries, but whose roof is now partially open to the sky, a man's eyes move beneath closed lids. His name is lost to us now, recorded only in a roster that may or may not survive in some archive. He is lying on straw, on a floor of packed earth, and his breathing is shallow and fractured, because his dreams have been invaded again by the sound of engines and the tremor of distant bombardment, a tremor that has become so constant over the past weeks that silence itself has become disturbing. When the first hand falls on his shoulder, he does not start. Something in him has already begun the slow surfacing toward wakefulness, as if some part of his consciousness has never fully surrendered to sleep at all. It is 04:30 in the morning, on a day in June 1944, and across the farmhouse and the half-dozen similar billets scattered through this corner of the Norman countryside, men are beginning to move. There is no bugle, there is no sharp command. Instead, there is only the quiet, nearly inaudible murmur of voices that have learned, through weeks of bombardment and artillery, that sound carries danger. A Panzergrenadier sergeant, a man perhaps in his mid-20s, though the weeks have aged him considerably, moves from sleeping figure to sleeping figure, his hand briefly touching shoulders, his voice no louder than a conversation between two people standing close. Wake, check your rifle. Water your face if you can. The words are never quite the same, but the rhythm is ritual now, and ritual is comforting in its predictability. There is a peculiar weight to the air in those moments before full dawn. It is not quite darkness, not yet light. The sky above the ruined sections of the farmhouse roof holds that strange quality of pre-morning blue that seems to come from nowhere, as if the earth itself is dimly luminescent, rather than the sky being bright. The men, as they rise, move like figures in an underwater dream. Their uniforms are caked with dust from the chalk-white earth of Normandy, dust that never quite washes away no matter how much they try. Their faces are lean, hollowed by insufficient sleep and the constant low hum of anxiety that runs beneath every moment when you are a soldier in a defensive position and the enemy is making incremental progress toward your lines every single day. In what was once the farmhouse kitchen, a man is attempting to make coffee. The word itself is generous. What he is making is a hot drink that occupies the name of coffee, without bearing much resemblance to the coffee that any of these men once knew, if they knew it at all. It is ersatz coffee, a substitute brew that became ubiquitous throughout Germany and German-occupied territory in the latter half of the war, as access to real colonial coffee became impossible. It is made from roasted grain, possibly mixed with chicory, possibly mixed with ingredients no one in the kitchen can quite identify or would wish to identify. The water is heated over a small, carefully controlled fire, kept as invisible as possible because smoke is a signal, and a signal is a target. The smell that rises from this pale, weak brew is not entirely unpleasant. It is warm, it is bitter, in a way that cuts through the fog of incomplete sleep. Several men gather around in small clusters, cupping the metal mess tins or makeshift containers in their hands, not for the taste, which is barely memorable, but for the warmth and for the small ritual of it. There is no comfort here except the comfort of routine. The coffee is distributed in quiet rotation. No one speaks unnecessarily. Somewhere beyond the outer walls of the farmhouse, a machine gun team is being roused. Somewhere down the narrow country lane that winds through this sector, a runner is beginning his silent movement from position to position, carrying orders that will be spoken so quietly that only the man directly receiving them will hear them clearly. The weight of sleep deprivation sits across these soldiers like a physical presence, a dull pressure that makes thinking slightly difficult and makes every sensation slightly muted, as if they are experiencing the world through a thin layer of cloth. For 3 weeks now, since well before the invasion itself, before the massive fleet appeared on the horizon and the paratroops began to fall in the darkness, the bombardment has been constant, or nearly constant. The English and the Americans have been teaching Normandy a lesson through high explosive and fragmentation. Whole villages inland have been reduced to rubble in attempts to cut off supply lines and disrupt German movements. The railways have been shattered almost to unusefulness. The roads have been torn apart. And even here, in this relatively quiet sector, the acoustic shadow of this larger destruction reaches constantly. Men sleep with one ear open. They wake at sounds that are not actual threats, phantom explosions that exist only in the nervous system's interpretation of distant rumble and wind. Over weeks, this accumulates. Sleep deprivation becomes a physical malady, not unlike a wound that doesn't quite heal. One man, as he drinks his warm substitute coffee, has not slept more than 3 hours consecutively in perhaps 2 weeks. His eyes have developed a slight tremor when he looks to the side. Another has begun to forget details of conversations he had the previous day. A third finds his hands shaking slightly when he tries to hold them still. These are not the symptoms of disease. These are the symptoms of prolonged stress and insufficient recovery, the price the nervous system exacts when it is kept in a state of high alert for too long. And yet, there is no alternative. No one speaks of this. To name it would be to give it a kind of official status, would be to acknowledge a weakness that cannot be accommodated in a military unit fighting for its survival. The orders, when they come, arrive not as commands, but as information. There will be a stand to. All positions will be fully manned. There are reports of movement to the south and the east, possibly a probing attack, possibly just reconnaissance, possibly nothing at all. But in Normandy in June 1944, the word possibly has ceased to have much meaning. Everything that can happen tends to happen, eventually. The men respond by checking their weapons with movements so practiced that they require almost no conscious attention. A Kar 98K rifle is field stripped and reassembled without looking, muscle memory overriding the fog of incomplete wakefulness. Ammunition pouches are checked. Grenades are verified as present and functional. Somewhere, a half-track is being cranked to life, its diesel engine turning over with a low rumble that sends a small flicker of nervousness through anyone who hears it, because engines are loud and engines attract attention. In that strange hour, between the last fully dark and the first true light, these men perform their rituals of readiness. They drink their thin coffee, they check their weapons, they study the maps and the written orders that describe their sector, the hedgerows and the sunken lanes and the open fields where an advancing enemy would have to cross exposed ground. They do all of this on sleep that is insufficient, on nerves that are worn, on bodies that are asking questions their minds cannot afford to answer. And somewhere beyond the walls of the farmhouse, in the pre-dawn darkness that is beginning only now to yield to the first hints of grey, the landscape of Normandy waits, patient and eternal, indifferent to whether the men crossing its fields are well rested or exhausted, whether they are afraid or resigned, whether they will see the sunset, or whether this particular June morning will be their last. And so, as these men moved through the darkness toward their positions, the very landscape itself became their teacher and their adversary, the bocage. There is perhaps no single term more bound up with the Normandy campaign than this Norman hedgerow country, and to understand how a single day unfolded for these Panzergrenadiers is to understand first the peculiar nature of the ground beneath their feet. Imagine, if you will, a patchwork quilt sewn together not with thread but with centuries of agriculture and inheritance. The bocage is not a natural landscape so much as a cultivated one, shaped over generations by Norman farmers who needed to divide their small plots, to contain their cattle, to mark boundaries. Over time, these divisions became walls, not walls of stone, though some were, but walls of vegetation, of root and branch and thorn woven so densely that a man standing on one side cannot see through to the other. The hedgerows themselves grew not as solitary lines, but as thick barriers, often 15, 20, sometimes 30 feet deep, their roots descending into banks of earth, raised over centuries, the banks themselves sometimes 6 or 8 feet high. In places, the lanes that ran between these hedgerows had sunk down 3, 4, even 5 feet below the surrounding field level, worn down by cartwheels and footfall across 500 years or more. This was the terrain, and when the Allies came ashore on the 6th of June and began to push inland, they discovered that their maps and their intelligence had not fully prepared them for what this landscape meant for warfare. You see, the bocage was a military nightmare for anyone attempting to move with speed or to employ the machinery of modern war. A tank cannot move quickly through such terrain. It cannot see far ahead. It becomes vulnerable in ways that it should not be. The hedgerows canalize movement, funnel soldiers and vehicles down narrow lanes where they are silhouetted against the sky, where they cannot fan out, where a single anti-tank gun positioned correctly can hold up an entire column. And yet, paradoxically, the bocage was also a nightmare for the defender trying to hold a continuous line, because the very thickness of the hedgerows meant that the front dissolved into 1,000 small, disconnected engagements. Control the bocage, and you do not control territory in any conventional sense. You control a series of small corners, small hedgerows, small sunken lanes. By the time these panzergrenadiers were settling into their positions in the pre-dawn hours, both sides had begun to understand, slowly, bloodily, at great cost, what the bocage demanded of them. The Germans, with their early advantage in training and their experience from earlier campaigns, grasped it perhaps more quickly than their opponents. They learned that in the bocage, a small, well-positioned squad could hold off a much larger force. They learned that the standard unit of maneuver became not the battalion or the company, but the squad, sometimes even smaller elements. They learned to site their defenses not on the most obvious line, but to create a defense in depth, with multiple hedgerow positions, each supporting the other through interlocking fields of fire. The bocage, in other words, made their work almost into a new kind of warfare, closer to fighting in a city than to the mobile warfare they had trained for. The Allies, particularly the Americans and British, found themselves having to unlearn certain assumptions about firepower and mobility. Their artillery, which was formidable, could not easily see over the hedgerows to call down fire on distant targets. Their air superiority, so overwhelming above open ground, became more difficult to employ when vehicles and men could hide beneath those thick canopies of green. They had to learn to fight differently, to dismount their infantry earlier, to move more carefully, to use what soldiers call tactics, rather than attempting to impose their overwhelming advantages of material. And so, over the course of that campaign, two different approaches to bocage warfare emerged, each side learning from the other, each adapting, each recognizing that the landscape was, in a very real sense, a combatant itself. For the individual panzergrenadier, what did this mean? Consider the perspective of a squad leader, a Feldwebel perhaps, moving his men into position as dawn approached. His whole concern became not the grand strategic picture, but the immediate tactical problem, which hedgerows provided good fields of fire, which lanes might allow the enemy to infiltrate, where to position his machine gun so that it could cover the most ground, where to sight his anti-tank rifle so that he could engage any approaching armor. The bocage demanded not grand maneuver but meticulous local knowledge. It was a landscape that rewarded the soldier who could read terrain, who could understand sight lines, who could think in 3 dimensions about a 10-meter patch of ground. What is interesting to consider is how this terrain, in some way, democratized the fighting. The overwhelming technological advantage that Germany had enjoyed in the early years of the war, the superiority of German tanks, German aircraft, German training, became less decisive in the bocage. A young British infantryman with a rifle could kill a panzer commander in this landscape just as effectively as on the open steppes of Russia. A Canadian private could stop a German column by destroying the lead vehicle in a sunken lane. The hedgerows did not care who had the better equipment. They demanded, rather, that each side adapt, that each side learn to move through them with caution, that each side understand that mere firepower alone could not win the day. And as these panzergrenadiers were moving up through the darkness, this was the knowledge that was guiding their movements. They knew, from the last few days of fighting, that the bocage was unforgiving. They knew that the enemy was somewhere in this landscape, positioned somewhere among these hedgerows, and that finding him and defeating him was not going to be a matter of rapid maneuver or overwhelming firepower, but of patience, local knowledge, small unit tactics, and a certain hard-won wisdom about how to survive in this particular landscape. The bocage had already taught them lessons in blood and in fear. Now, in the early morning hours, they were putting those lessons into practice, moving carefully, keeping to the shadows and the shelter of the hedgerows themselves, understanding that the terrain that was their enemy to the rear was now their ally in the days ahead. In the darkness, with the mist still rising from the fields and the distant sound of artillery continuing its low murmur, they moved forward into the waiting bocage, toward whatever the day would bring. The fog rolled thicker, as the first light began its slow climb beyond the eastern hedgerows. It was the kind of dawn mist that clung to the Norman bocage like a blessing, obscuring the ground ahead to perhaps 50 meters, perhaps less, depending on the slope and the wind that barely moved through the dense thickets. The men of the Panzergrenadier squad, now fully alert though still moving with the heaviness of exhaustion, understood without needing to be told that this fog was their only protection during the vulnerable hour of moving up the sunken lane toward their assigned sector. The platoon sergeant, a man named Keller whose name most of the younger replacements barely knew, passed the order down with 2 sharp whispers and a hand signal. Column of 2s, stay in the ruts of the lane, weapons at low ready but not at high port. Keep the spacing tight enough to see the man ahead, but loose enough that shrapnel wouldn't take 2 at once. These were the rhythms of movement that had been drilled into them repeatedly during training, and they remained embedded even in the fog and the half-light, even in the weight of sleep deprivation and the slow accumulation of fear. The marching order itself followed a logic born from hard experience in other theatres, other hedgerows, other moments when the air had suddenly filled with the sound of engines and the terrible whine of rockets firing from aircraft that appeared out of nowhere. A 2-man point squad moved about 20 meters ahead, their rifles ready, their eyes sweeping for any movement that might suggest Canadian or British patrols had pushed further down this particular lane during the night. Behind them came the main body of the squad, divided into 2 columns for better speed and dispersion, left side and right side of the narrow lane, moving through the damp grass and loose stone of the sunken path that generations of Norman carts had worn into the earth over centuries. The second in command, and the MG-34 gunner with his assistant, stayed near the center of the formation, the machine gun slung but ready to be deployed if contact came suddenly from either flank. The weight of the uniform and equipment was substantial. The wool tunic, now damp from the fog and the morning dew that had soaked everything, the canvas webbing that held ammunition pouches, the steel helmet with its slight rim, the rifle or submachine gun depending on the soldier's role, gas mask carrier, though gas was no longer a likely threat by 1944, entrenching tool, water bottle, and the inevitable small items that accumulated, a photograph, a letter from home, perhaps a small loaf of black bread wrapped in cloth. For the newer men, those who had arrived as replacements only weeks earlier, the accumulated weight felt like it might press them into the soft earth of the lane itself. What made the movement particularly tense, though this tension was rarely voiced aloud, was the absolute vulnerability of the open sky. Even with the fog, they knew from bitter experience that the dawn hours were when the Allied fighter bombers liked to hunt. The Typhoons and Mustangs and Spitfires, equipped with rockets and machine guns, and flown by pilots who had already claimed air superiority over Normandy, often moved at dawn when visibility began to clear, but when they could still see the mist clinging to the ground and make out the shapes of men moving through lanes and across fields. A single pilot, alert and lucky, could see the telltale signs of movement, the disturbed fog, the sparkle of light on equipment, the dark smear of a column of men where the grass had been flattened by passage. This fear of air attack, though carefully controlled and never dwelt upon openly, was perhaps the most corrosive element of the daily experience. It was not like the fear of facing infantry or anti-tank guns, which were at least predictable and could be addressed through tactics and training. The fear of aircraft was almost metaphysical, omnipresent, invisible until the last moment, and catastrophic when it arrived. A man might move perfectly through the bocage, might navigate the sunken lanes with flawless discipline, might follow orders without hesitation, and still be struck down by something he had neither heard nor seen coming. The column moved slowly, deliberately, taking perhaps 10 minutes to cover what might have been done in 2 or 3 if speed had been possible. But speed was not possible, because speed meant carelessness, and carelessness meant death, from Allied fighters, from anti-tank guns concealed in the hedgerows ahead, from snipers who had learned to position themselves in the high ground overlooking these very lanes. Each man, as he placed one boot in front of the other on the worn earth of the lane, was conscious of this terrible calculus between urgency and caution. The camouflage discipline during this movement was absolute, though much of it was simply common sense born of survival. The men had been instructed repeatedly to move along the shadows of the hedgerow walls, to avoid silhouetting themselves against the slightly lighter sky, to keep their equipment from rattling by securing anything that might make noise with cloth or by careful gripping. Several of the soldiers had added fresh foliage to their helmets and shoulders during the pre-dawn darkness, small branches of oak and birch, leaves still wet and clinging, giving them a slightly vegetated appearance if glimpsed through the mist. This was not the formal camouflage netting they had seen in some divisions, but rather the practical, immediate camouflage of men who had learned that survival often meant blending with the immediate environment rather than relying on issued equipment. The sound discipline was perhaps even more critical than visual camouflage. Voices were not raised above a whisper. Hand signals were preferred to spoken orders whenever possible. The only sounds were the soft pad of boots on stone and grass, the barely audible clink of a rifle sling adjusting on a shoulder, and occasionally the soft splashing of feet in the shallow water that pooled in the lowest parts of the sunken lane. Even coughing was swallowed or suppressed. A man with a tickle in his throat might press his face against his sleeve for entire minutes, rather than risk the sound that might carry through the fog to ears that might be listening. What was difficult to convey in the actual experience, though it might be observed by historians and analysts decades later, looking at maps and reading reports, was the strange temporal distortion that occurred during such movements. Time seemed to move both slowly and quickly simultaneously. Each step felt deliberate and lengthy, and yet the passage from the starting point to the scheduled destination seemed to happen almost without transition. The mind, occupied with the mechanics of camouflage and sound discipline, and the constant scanning of the terrain ahead and to either side, fell into a state of focused hyper-awareness that left little room for conscious thought. Fear was there, certainly, but it was subsumed into the physical routines of movement, becoming simply part of the landscape of sensation, rather than an emotional state that needed to be addressed or overcome. By perhaps 05:45, as the fog began to thin almost imperceptibly, and the light continued its patient climb into the sky, the point squad reached a crossroads in the sunken lanes, where several paths converged, the kind of junction that could be dangerous because it offered multiple approaches for enemy patrols, and because movement at such locations seemed always to be visible to someone, somewhere, looking from higher ground. Here the column halted for several minutes, compressed into even tighter spacing within the narrower sections of lane, while Keller and one of the senior NCOs moved forward to confirm that the junction was as it had been reported, and that no fresh obstacles or signs of enemy activity had appeared during the night. The men who were resting during this pause did not sit down. To sit meant being slower to rise when movement resumed, but rather shifted their weight from one foot to the other and let their minds drift toward the destination, the relative safety of the hedgerow line, where they would dig in and wait for the next phase of the day to unfold. And yet, before we follow these men further into that June morning, we must pause and sit with a harder question, one that historians still wrestle with in quiet archives and seminars, a question that cannot be avoided if we are truly to understand who these soldiers were, beyond their uniforms and their weaponry. The Waffen-SS Panzergrenadiers were not conscripts drawn at random from the general population. They were volunteers, or men reassigned from the Hitler Youth apparatus, and they had passed through training pipelines designed not merely to teach them how to fight, but to embed within them a particular ideological worldview. How do we hold both truths at once? That they were young men, many barely into their 20s, who experienced fear and homesickness and a desire simply to survive the day, and that they were simultaneously members of an organization built on racial ideology and fanaticism. Historians do not shy away from this tension anymore. They examine it. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the very name carries weight, had been formed largely from boys who had grown up entirely within the Hitler Youth system. Many had never known Germany outside the Nazi state. Their entire adolescence had been shaped by mandatory paramilitary training, by ideology woven into education, by a cultural apparatus that began indoctrinating them in childhood. When these young men volunteered for the Waffen-SS, they were not turning away from an existing German culture they had rejected. They were stepping forward into what they had been told was the natural expression of their identity. Some historians suggest that in the very youngest cohorts, ideology and biology and youthful enthusiasm became almost inseparable. That is not an excuse. It is an observation about how totalitarianism functions at scale, how it colonizes consciousness itself, particularly in children who have known nothing else. The training pipeline for these Panzergrenadiers began earlier than most armies' conscription processes. Boys identified as racially and politically suitable would be channeled through intensified Hitler Youth programs, then into Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS recruit depots. They learned small unit tactics, weapons handling, and the mechanics of armored warfare. But they also received political education, lectures on racial ideology, on the necessity of German victory, on the enemy as something less than fully human. Some of this indoctrination was crude and obvious. Some was subtle, embedded in the language of orders, in the stories told around fires, in the casual acceptance of certain premises about the world. We cannot say that every single man believed it all with equal fervor. Soldiers' letters, when they survive, show a spectrum of belief and doubt. But the system was designed to make independent thinking difficult, to channel questions away, to reward obedience and enthusiasm, and to punish hesitation. By 1944, however, that ideological apparatus was beginning to fracture under the weight of military reality. Germany was losing. Boys who had been promised a 1,000-year Reich were now watching their cities burn from Allied bombing. They were being sent to fight in France knowing that they would likely die there. The confidence of early Nazi messaging, the certainty of victory, the assurances of racial superiority became harder to sustain when you were digging a hole in a Norman hedgerow and wondering if you would live to see sundown. Historians find in the diaries and letters of late-war German soldiers a growing exhaustion with ideology itself, a turning inward toward personal concerns, toward family, toward simple survival. The totalitarian state's grip on consciousness was loosening, not because these men had suddenly become democrats or moralists, but because they were tired and afraid and dying. What do we do with this knowledge when we try to understand the human beings involved? How do we avoid both extremes? The one that sees Waffen-SS soldiers as uniquely evil monsters, beyond comprehension or sympathy, and the one that treats them as hapless victims of circumstance, stripped of all agency and responsibility. The current historical consensus, arrived at through decades of careful scholarship in German, English, French, and Polish archives, seems to be that we must hold complexity. These were young men, some of them barely 18, who had been socialized within a genocidal regime, trained to fight for it, told that their sacrifice was necessary and glorious. Many of them genuinely believed some of what they had been taught, whether about German destiny or the threat posed by enemies. Some were true believers in Nazi ideology to the end. Some were cynics who had learned to mouth the slogans and survive. Most fell somewhere in between, compartmentalizing, obeying, hoping, doubting in ways that shifted day by day, and sometimes moment by moment. The military record of the 12th SS Panzer Division shows a unit that fought with considerable skill and ferocity, that held difficult terrain in Normandy for weeks, that inflicted real casualties on the Allied invasion force. It also shows a unit that committed war crimes, that executed prisoners and civilians, that operated within a military structure that was itself integrated into the broader Nazi apparatus of genocide and enslavement. These facts do not contradict each other. They were simultaneous. The same men who maintained the engines of half-tracks with technical competence were part of a larger system designed to annihilate. We need not diminish either observation to accommodate the other. And so we sit with this discomfort, this tension that has no easy resolution, and it is perhaps fitting that we do so in the quiet of the night, when the guards are less rigid, when the usual categories seem to soften slightly. For in the long darkness, when sleep begins to approach, we understand more intuitively that human beings are not simple, that history itself is not a morality play with clearly marked villains and heroes, and that the most important work of understanding is often to refuse to look away from exactly the kinds of contradictions that keep us awake. And yet the night continues, the hours move forward, and these men in their slit trenches and farmhouse billets continue with their existence, carrying all of this, their training, their beliefs, their doubts, their fears, their exhaustion, into whatever the next hours will bring. The fog has grown thicker now, almost touchable in the pre-dawn stillness, and the sound of the German company moving through the bockages is muffled, boots on soft earth, the whisper of equipment settling, the occasional low word passed hand to hand along the line. It is 6 o'clock exactly, or very nearly so, though no one is looking at a wristwatch in this half-light. The men are in position along a sunken lane, perhaps 2 kilometers northeast of their original billet, having moved through the orchard and then along a narrow track that the local farmer had used for generations, a path so old and worn that it ran nearly shoulder-deep between the banks of the hedgerow. The company is spread thin, as Panzergrenadier units always were in the bocage, too few men, in truth, for the frontage they were asked to hold, and the squad sergeants have positioned each 4-man team and 5-man team with careful eyes on the fields before them, trying to imagine how the enemy might move through this patchwork of stone walls and apple trees. It is a question that has occupied German tactical thinking since the paratroopers began landing in the darkness 5 days ago. How does infantry fight in terrain that offers no clear sight lines, no open killing ground? How do you defend when your advantage, the German soldiers' long-standing superiority in rapid fire and coordinated defense, becomes nearly meaningless in a maze of hedgerows where a man 50 meters away might as well be invisible? The fog helps in this moment because it deepens that chaos, and the company commander, a 32-year-old Hauptsturmführer named Klaus, who had survived Russia and come to France believing himself unkillable, has used the grey dawn to tighten the positions one more time. The men are tired, genuinely exhausted in a way that sleep 3 hours before dawn cannot repair, and he can see it in the slope of their shoulders, the way some of them are still chewing on the dry bread and meat paste they received at 4 in the morning. Not because they are hungry, but because chewing is something to do while waiting. And then, from somewhere beyond the fog to the west, comes a sound that draws every head upright at once. It is the mechanical grinding of a tank engine, distant but unmistakable, and it carries with it all the weight of everything these men have learned in the past week about Allied armor. The engine note is different from German tanks, higher pitched, almost frantic by comparison, and it grows louder and louder still, and there is a moment of absolute stillness along the German line, the kind of silence that only happens when many men simultaneously stop breathing properly. The fog is moving slightly now, pushed by an invisible wind, and through a gap perhaps 30 meters away, a Sherman tank emerges, not at speed, but carefully, as though the crew inside is frightened of what they might find, which of course they are. The tank pauses. The barrel of its gun swings very slowly, almost as if it is sniffing the air, and someone along the German line, it is not recorded who, breathes out so loudly that his neighbors can hear it. The Panzergrenadiers have been trained for this, trained extensively, and the machine gun teams know exactly what to do. There are 2 MG-34s in the squad positions closest to the field where the Sherman has appeared, and their crews have been waiting for something like this all morning, waiting with the patience that comes only from fear and discipline mixed together in equal measure. One of the gun teams, positioned in a shallow scrape perhaps 3 meters from the sunken lane, opens fire without waiting for orders. This is the kind of moment where rigid hierarchy dissolves into instinct and training, and the sound is extraordinary, almost shocking in the fog. The MG-34 fires at a rate of 900 rounds per minute, a sound like tearing fabric magnified until it seems to fill the entire narrow world of the bocage. The bullets spark off the Sherman's hull, finding nothing vital, nothing that will stop it. But the very fact of the German fire, the precision of it, seems to surprise the Sherman crew. The tank's engine note changes pitch, rising, and through the gun smoke and the fog, the Sherman's turret swings toward the source of the fire. The second machine gun joins in now, and this one has a different arc, firing across the front of the tank, trying to force its commander to keep his head down, to prevent him from seeing the Panzergrenadier positions clearly. The fog is their ally here, because even though the Sherman's crew can hear the machine guns, they cannot see the German positions with any clarity, and the bocage itself is working against the armor. This is almost the only circumstance in which a Panzergrenadier squad, equipped with rifles and machine guns, and perhaps a Panzerfaust or two, can stand against a medium tank, when the terrain is broken, when the fog is thick, when the tank crew is already frightened. The Sherman's gun fires once, and the shot passes high, well above the German line, and the blast of it is shocking, a sound like the world cracking open, and in its aftermath, there is the whisper of debris falling back to earth. What happens next is a decision made in fractions of a second, probably by the Sherman's commander, possibly by the driver. The tank does not advance. Instead, its engine note changes again, and it begins to reverse slowly into the fog, withdrawing the way it came. And the German machine gunners keep firing until the tank is out of sight, until even the sound of its engine begins to fade. And then there is the terrible silence that follows sudden violence. It lasts perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps a minute. Time is very difficult to measure in these moments. The company commander does not order ceasefire. The gunners simply stop on their own, and in that quiet, the fog seems to come in even thicker, as though the landscape itself has exhaled. Someone coughs. Somewhere down the line, a young Panzergrenadier, perhaps 19 years old, begins to shake slightly, and his squad sergeant puts a hand on his shoulder without saying anything, because there is nothing to say. The Sherman is gone. It was a probe, a reconnaissance, an attempt to find the strength and position of the German line, and it has been answered, at least for now. But the question it raises hangs in the fog like the gun smoke itself. Are there more tanks behind it? Will they come in greater numbers? How long can 35 tired men hold a position that was designed for twice that many? The company commander has already sent a runner back to battalion headquarters, a request for reinforcement that he knows will probably be denied, will probably elicit orders to hold the line regardless, and he stands now in the sunken lane with his hands on his hips, staring into the fog where the Sherman disappeared. It is 6:20 in the morning. There are 14 hours of daylight still to come, or what passes for daylight in a day filled with fog and cloud and the permanent half-light of war. He has held his ground in the first real test of the morning, and somewhere in his mind he is already calculating what will happen when the test comes again, as it inevitably will. The half-track that carried these men was not a tank, though soldiers often mistook its role as such. The SDKFZ 251, or Sonderkraftfahrzeug 251, as the German designation read in its full and rather clinical way, was something altogether different from the armoured vehicles that preceded it in the German army's inventory. It was, in essence, a marriage of two technologies that had seemed incompatible until German engineers solved the problem in the late 1930s, the firepower and protection of a fighting vehicle paired with the mobility and carrying capacity of a truck. The result, by 1944, was something that had become utterly indispensable to mechanized warfare, yet remained perpetually vulnerable, perpetually inadequate, and absolutely central to how Panzergrenadiers survived and moved. Picture, if you will, the construction of this machine. Its hull was formed from welded steel plates, sloped at angles calculated to deflect rather than absorb incoming fire. The front end, where the driver sat, was relatively narrow and pointed, allowing it to slip through the dense bocage terrain more readily than a full-tracked tank could manage. Behind the driver, the hull opened into a spacious cargo compartment, high-sided and mostly open to the sky, with a canvas cover that could be stretched across in bad weather or for concealment. 10 men could fit in the back, sitting on bench seats that ran the length of the hull, their legs interlocking slightly in the manner of soldiers, in transport everywhere and every era. The engine, a Maybach liquid-cooled gasoline motor, sat immediately behind the driver's cabin, and its sound, a distinctive, somewhat whining mechanical note, became as familiar to German soldiers as their own heartbeats. What made the 251 truly remarkable, however, was not its armor or its engine, but the fact that it ran on both tracks and wheels simultaneously. The front wheels steered the vehicle and bore the engine's weight, while the rear half was entirely tracked, powered by the same transmission that drove those front wheels. This peculiar arrangement meant that the 251 could navigate terrain that would strand a conventional truck, yet remained faster and more fuel-efficient than a fully tracked vehicle of comparable capacity. On roads, it could achieve a respectable speed for its time. Cross-country, in the mud and hedgerow terrain of Normandy, it became something more like a methodical, purposeful crawl, and soldiers learned to time their movements accordingly. The crew that operated a 251 in a Panzergrenadier unit was typically quite small: a driver, a commander, and perhaps a gunner or loader for whatever weapon the half-track carried in its configuration. There were several variants by 1944, though the men inside rarely distinguished between them in conversation. They simply called them half-tracks and trusted that whoever was commanding the vehicle knew its specific capabilities. Some carried a 7.92mm machine gun mounted on a flexible post in the open cargo area. Others had been fitted with a 37mm anti-tank gun, or, in rarer cases, a 75mm gun howitzer hybrid that made the whole vehicle sit low and ponderous in the mud. A few specialized variants carried communications equipment, or flamethrowers, or little more than ammunition and supplies. The men who maintained these machines in the field were rarely celebrated in history, yet their work was utterly unforgiving. A half-track could not be jury-rigged or partially repaired the way a motorcycle might be. Its mechanical complexity demanded genuine technical skill, and by 1944, the Panzergrenadier units in Normandy were operating well beyond their original supply lines, meaning that replacement parts were scarce and improvisation was constant. A broken transmission could mean that a vehicle was stranded for days, and soldiers would work by lamplight in barns or hedgerow corners, hands freezing, knowing that every hour the vehicle was immobilized was an hour their company fought with reduced firepower and carrying capacity. Consider for a moment the particular vulnerability of the half-track as a fighting platform. Its open cargo compartment, which allowed for such flexibility in deployment, was also its greatest weakness. Machine gun fire, shell fragments, mortar rounds. These swept across that open space with nothing to stop them but the thin canvas cover, which might as well not have existed. The armor protection the vehicle did possess was modest compared to a tank's, and shaped only to protect against lighter weapons. A well-aimed anti-tank rifle round, or a near miss from artillery, could penetrate the sides easily enough. Soldiers riding in the back of a moving 251 under fire were gambling with odds that they knew, consciously or not, were not in their favor. Yet there was an odd comfort to being inside one, despite the danger. The bench seats meant that a man could rest his weight, shift his position, and sit upright, rather than being hunched in a tank turret or compressed into a tight fighting compartment. There was ventilation, fresh air, the ability to see outside through the canvas or the gaps in the sides. In the early morning hours of that June day, when the Panzergrenadiers moved up toward their positions, the half-tracks carried them at a walking pace, and some men may have dozed against their neighbors' shoulders despite the rumble of engines and the constant vigilance required. The movement itself, the rhythm of it, was almost meditative. The drivers who piloted these vehicles developed a particular kind of skill that historians seldom mention. They needed to understand terrain instinctively, to read the ground ahead for soft spots, to judge the incline and composition of a slope, and know whether the 251's hybrid running gear could manage it. They needed to keep the vehicle moving steadily enough that the men in the back weren't thrown about, yet quickly enough to minimize exposure during movement under fire. They operated in a state of constant low-level fear, knowing that they were visible targets, that a stall or mechanical failure could strand their entire squad. Some of the most decorated drivers in Panzergrenadier units were promoted not because of bravery in combat, but because they had the preternatural sense of a vehicle and terrain that kept their crews alive day after day. By mid-1944, fuel was becoming a serious issue for German units everywhere, and the Panzergrenadiers were no exception. The 251's gasoline engine was relatively efficient for its size, but it still required consistent refueling, and the supply chain that had once been robust was becoming increasingly uncertain. Stories filtered through the ranks of units stranded because fuel hadn't arrived, of half-tracks abandoned or cannibalized for parts when there was no way to keep them running. A good driver could stretch fuel consumption through smooth operation and careful maintenance, and these men were valued accordingly, spoken of with a kind of quiet respect that transcended normal rank hierarchies. The relationship between a Panzergrenadier and his half-track was not sentimental, but it was real. The vehicle was his shelter, his transport, his company's mobile firepower. It was also a liability, a target, a source of mechanical frustration, and, in the humid June weather of Normandy, a metal box that trapped heat and the acrid smell of gasoline and diesel exhaust. When soldiers wrote letters home, they rarely mentioned vehicles by name, yet officers and sergeants knew that the condition and availability of their half-tracks determined whether orders could be executed or merely attempted. A unit with 4 functioning 25-1s could be deployed. The same unit with 2 or 3 became something else entirely, a partial force, a compromise. And so, as that June day wore on, the 25-1s of the Panzergrenadier Company sat in their concealed positions, engines shut down to avoid detection, their crews performing the endless small maintenance tasks that kept them battle-ready. A driver might check the track tension, running his hand along the rubber blocks to feel for cracks or excessive wear. A gunner might oil the machine gun again, though it had been oiled that morning and the morning before. A commander would review the fuel situation with another officer, calculating whether the fuel in the tanks would be sufficient for the next phase of movement, whatever that might be. These were not dramatic tasks, but they were necessary, and they consumed the hours between battle and sleep with the quiet, methodical rhythm that held armies together. The morning sun had begun to burn away the fog by 7 o'clock, and what emerged was neither shelter nor mercy. The Panzergrenadiers had settled into their positions along the hedgerow in the deepening light, each man finding what cover the centuries-old earth walls could offer. Some crouched behind the thickest bramble, others in shallow slit trenches hastily deepened with entrenching tools during the first hours of darkness. The bocage, in daylight, revealed itself as both fortress and trap. The high banks of earth and root that rose 6 feet or more on either side of the sunken lane provided excellent protection from direct fire, yet they also restricted movement, limited sight lines, and created narrow corridors where a single well-placed shell could funnel death along the entire length. Above the hedgerow, the sky was clearing to a pale blue. A young Obergefreiter, a lance corporal, perhaps 23 years old, sat with his back against the bank, cleaning his MP-40 submachine gun with a cloth that had once been white, but was now stained the color of rust and motor oil. His name was lost, as so many names were lost, but his habits were the habits of 10,000 men that morning. He had been doing this for perhaps 4 minutes when the first shell whistle came, not directly above him, but perhaps 200 meters to the north, toward the company's left flank. The explosion was muffled by the terrain, a sound like furniture being overturned in a distant room. Around him, he felt more than heard the collective intake of breath. No one moved. There was a protocol to bombardment. You waited for the pattern to reveal itself. You did not waste energy on fear until you knew whether you should waste it. The next shell landed closer, perhaps 130 meters, and this time The concussion was felt in the chest. Small stones fell from the hedgerow ceiling. A man 2 positions down the trench muttered something under his breath, a prayer or a curse, indistinguishable in tone. The young Obergefreiter resumed cleaning his gun. The maintenance of weapons was one of the few actions that remained entirely within one's control, and control, even the illusion of it, was its own form of survival. By 7:40, the bombardment seemed to have moved elsewhere. No shells had struck their particular stretch of line, though the earth still hummed with sympathetic vibration from impacts farther away. The smell of cordite hung in the air like morning mist, acrid and somehow clarifying. Somewhere to the rear, a water ration was being distributed, 2 canteens per squad from the limited supply that had made its way forward in the pre-dawn darkness. The water tasted of the metal it had travelled in, and of something chemical, something meant to prevent disease, but no one complained. Thirst was a smaller problem than hunger or fear. It was around this time, in these moments of enforced stillness between bombardments, that men's hands often found their way to the things they carried closest to their bodies. A Panzergrenadier's kit was spare. His field pack contained ammunition, field rations, a gas mask he had not needed to use since 1940, spare socks that were worth more than the socks themselves at this stage of the war, a small spade, a mess kit, but in pockets, pressed close to the chest or kept beneath a wool tunic despite the June heat, were the things that mattered. A letter, perhaps, written weeks or months ago on paper that had grown soft from handling, from a mother, or from a wife in Vienna, or from a sister who wrote news of neighbours and the changing seasons. Could letters have travelled all the way from Germany in time? Perhaps not new ones, supply lines were dissolving, but old ones, reread until the creases were soft as cloth. Some men never opened them again once they reached the front. To reread them was to invite the thought that you might not go home, that these words might be the last you ever heard from that hand. A photograph was another thing men kept. A girl in her Sunday dress, standing in front of a town square fountain, the photo small enough to fit in a shirt pocket and worn enough at the edges that her face had begun to fade. A family standing formally before a house, all of them looking as though they had been told not to smile, and so they had obeyed, staring at the camera with the resigned expression of people who understood that photographs were serious business. Children, small and clean, from before the war. An older man, a father, wearing the uniform of the previous war, the First World War, standing rigid and solemn in a way that suggested he already knew things about what uniforms meant. Around 8 in the morning, there came a brief lull of sufficient duration that some of the squad leaders made the decision to distribute the midday rations early. Perhaps it was better to eat now, while the stomach could still appreciate it, than to wait and risk another bombardment that might make eating impossible. The rations were standardized, issued from the regiment, and had been designed by quartermaster officers who had never eaten them in a trench under intermittent shell fire. A tin of meat, horse, primarily, though no one asked directly, sealed with a key that required teeth to operate properly. A hard biscuit, or what the German army called hartkeks, dense enough to break a tooth if you were not careful, and flavourless enough to taste almost medicinal. A small chocolate bar, hard with age. Salt. A packet of ersatz coffee, to be mixed with water, if you could heat water, which you often could not. Did these men feel grateful for the food, or resentful of its inadequacy? Historians might debate that, but the letters that survived, found decades later in archives or in private collections, suggest that the experience of eating in war was complicated by something more than taste. One soldier, writing home from Normandy in those early weeks of June, described eating in the presence of death, and noted that the food tasted of smoke and fear and something else he could not quite name. The mechanical act of eating, moving the biscuit from tin to mouth to stomach, required a kind of cognitive separation from the reality of where you were. You had to think about the taste and the texture and ignore the sounds from elsewhere in the hedgerow, the occasional cry of a wounded man being helped toward an aid station, the rumble of tracked vehicles somewhere to the rear. By 8:30, the shells had become less frequent. This too was a pattern that soldiers learned to read. A lull meant either that the enemy was regrouping or moving to a new target, or that they were running low on ammunition. It meant either that you might have an hour of relative peace, or that something larger was being prepared. A Panzergrenadier who survived this day might have thought about such things. He might have wondered whether the Canadian or British infantry would probe again, whether the supply line would hold, whether the air would remain quiet above the hedgerow, or whether the roar of fighter bombers would return. Around 9 o'clock, there came an order passed down from the company command post, a slight redistribution of positions, a rotation of watch duties, a directive to check weapons again, and to ensure that the ammunition was properly stored and accessible. The sun was higher now, and the hedgerow offered less shade. Men began to notice the heat. Some tried to sleep, pressing themselves into the earth bank and closing their eyes, as though sleep were something that could be simply commanded. Others stared outward or inward, their thoughts following paths that only they could trace. Letters remained unfolded. Photographs remained in pockets, not because the men had forgotten them, but because looking at them too often seemed to use up something essential, a reserve of hope, perhaps, or a carefully rationed supply of home. The rhythm of bombardment resumed around 9 o'clock, but from a different direction, and the men adjusted their posture slightly, the way animals adjust to a change in wind direction. They had done this for how many hours now? Since 4 in the morning. Perhaps it would end soon. Perhaps it would not. The present moment was all that could be held safely in the mind, and even the present moment was becoming difficult to hold as the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down and the uncertainty stretched forward into the afternoon. In the quiet hours between bombardments, when a soldier managed to find paper and something resembling a pen, he would begin to write. The letters that survive from the Panzergrenadiers of 1944 Normandy exist now in military archives across Europe, in the Bundesarchiv, Militärarchiv, in private collections held by descendants, in museum repositories in both France and Germany, and they offer something that no official report or tactical diagram could ever convey. They offer the voice of homesickness made physical on paper, the ache of distance transformed into words, often written by men who had learned that tomorrow might not arrive. Most of these letters never left France. Many were found among the personal effects of the dead, recovered weeks or months later by burial details, their ink already fading. Some were never sealed. Others reached their destinations months after the war ended, redirected through the chaos of 1945, or simply lost in the machinery of postal systems collapsing under the weight of a continent torn open. But enough survived to form a kind of archive of ordinary longing, not the grand ideological statements that appear in propaganda materials or official correspondence, but something far more intimate and true. A father asking about his son's schooling. A young man, barely 20, describing the taste of real milk because he has not had any in weeks. A husband counting the months since he last held his wife. One of the most striking elements of these letters, for historians who have studied them carefully, is how rarely they mention the fighting directly. The censors, certainly, played a role in this restraint. Military postal censorship was rigorous throughout the German armed forces, and letters containing tactical information, complaints about command, or anything that might damage morale were routinely returned to senders or simply intercepted. But beyond the reach of the censor's pen, there was something else at work. Soldiers seemed to understand, with an almost instinctive wisdom, that there was no way to describe what they were experiencing to someone who was not there. So instead of describing the shelling, or the fear, or the smell of cordite and burnt metal, they wrote around it. They wrote about the weather. They wrote about what they could see from their foxhole, the apple trees in blossom, the shape of the clouds, the particular quality of the light at dawn. They wrote about food, endlessly about food. Letters from the Bocage in June 1944 are filled with minute descriptions of meals, imaginary menus, recipes half remembered from home. This phenomenon is not unique to the Waffen-SS, of course. American soldiers wrote similar letters home, British soldiers, Canadian soldiers. But there is something particular in the German correspondence from this period, because so many of these men knew, at some level, that they were fighting a war that was already lost. The letters from 1944 carry a weight of resignation beneath the surface optimism, a kind of twilight awareness. Some writers attempted to maintain conviction in German victory, even as the reality of American industrial might and Soviet pressure closed in. Others seem to have set that aside entirely and simply wrote about home, about the farm they hoped to return to, the garden they had left, the sweetheart waiting, the siblings they barely remembered because they had been conscripted so young. The archives reveal, too, something about the structure of these men's lives before the war, at least for those whose letters survived. A Panzergrenadier company in Normandy in June 1944 was not a monolith. It included, as most military units do, men of different ages and different backgrounds, some rural, some from cities, some educated in universities before conscription, some with only a few years of schooling. A letter from a former schoolteacher in the unit reads very differently from one written by a farmer's son. The vocabulary is different, the preoccupations are different, and yet beneath the surface, the longing is the same. All of them wanted to know that their homes still existed, that the people they loved were still waiting, that the world they came from had not simply ceased to be in their absence. Where the archives grow particularly poignant is in the letters that were never answered. Some Panzergrenadiers wrote home regularly, and their letters accumulated in family papers, kept safe through decades, because they had become precious, the last words from someone who did not come home. A historian examining such a collection sees not only the letter itself, but the envelope, the handwriting as it becomes shakier over time, the fading of the ink. Sometimes the date on the letter can be cross-referenced with casualty lists, and it becomes clear that the man who wrote it was killed within days or weeks of putting pen to paper. In some cases, the final letter was written just hours before death, and reading such a thing now, knowing what the writer did not, creates a particular kind of sadness that transcends even the typical melancholy of war. The content of letters also reveals the rhythm of fear and adaptation. Early letters from France, those written in June and early July 1944, often express a kind of anxious uncertainty. Will the invasion succeed? Will we be pushed back into the sea? Will the Americans and British advance inland, or will we hold? But as summer deepens, a different tone emerges. The Panzergrenadiers realized they would not be quickly pushed back into the Channel. They also realized they were not going to advance far inland. The fighting settled into something grinding and awful and static. The letters from August and September read as though written by men slowly adjusting to the possibility that this might be permanent, that they might never leave this hedgerow country, this cursed bocage that offered cover but no escape. Some soldiers began to make peace, as humans do. They stopped writing about victory and began writing about survival. They wrote about the men in their squad who had become closer than brothers. They wrote about small kindnesses received from French civilians despite the occupation, details that would have horrified their commanders had they been read by the wrong eyes. They wrote about a German medic who had treated a wounded French farmer's child without being asked to do so, about a moment of shared humanity in the midst of systematic brutality. These glimpses are rare in the archives, but they exist, fragile testimonies to something more complicated than propaganda would allow. The letters also preserve something of the material culture of daily life that often disappears from official military records. Soldiers wrote about the contents of their ration packs, the quality of the ersatz coffee, the luxury of a real cigarette, as opposed to the thin paper ones made from leftover tobacco. They wrote about their uniforms beginning to wear out, about boots with holes in them, about the weight of ammunition and the ache in their backs. They wrote, sometimes obliquely and sometimes directly, about hunger. By mid-1944, supply lines were fragmenting, and the letters make clear that men in the bocage were not always well fed. One letter, dated August 1944, describes a ration of black bread and margarine, and the writer thanks his correspondent for a package of dried fruit sent from home, saying it was more precious than gold. Historians who work with these materials often remark on the absence of certain themes that might be expected. There is remarkably little about ideology, especially compared to some of the official Nazi correspondence from the same period. The letters do not typically burst with fervent belief in the Thousand-Year Reich or contempt for the enemies of Germany. Some letters certainly reflect the worldview that their writers had been raised in, absorbed through education and propaganda. But many simply do not. It is as though, when writing to family, the Panzergrenadiers set aside the grand narratives and returned to something more elemental: connection with home, with people loved, with a self that existed before the war transformed everything. What emerges from reading these letters over hours, or days, or the longer academic study that historians undertake, is a picture of men suspended between two worlds. They were still in Normandy, in the hedgerows, in the foxholes and half-tracks. But through the act of writing, through the summoning of memory and detail and tenderness in their words, they were also somewhere else entirely. They were walking through their childhood village. They were sitting at a table with family. They were holding someone's hand. The letters were a kind of time travel, a way of reaching backward to themselves before the war, and reaching forward in hope to a version of themselves that might yet come home. Whether or not that hope would be fulfilled is a question the archives answer differently for each man, each letter, each envelope that survived the chaos of collapsing Germany and the 70 and more years since. The quiet persistence of these letters, the fact that they were kept, often at great cost, through wars and exiles and the sorting of lives into storage boxes, speaks to something deeper than curiosity or historical interest. It speaks to the understanding that soldiers are not simply soldiers. They are also sons and husbands and lovers and brothers. And sometimes, in a moment of fortune, what they wrote about that other part of their lives survives to tell us something true about what it meant to be human in the midst of inhuman circumstances. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, as the June sunlight grew more direct and the mist lifted further from the bocage, a low mechanical rumble began to sound from deeper in the German defensive network. It was neither the harsh percussion of small arms fire nor the erratic crash of artillery, but something altogether different: the heavy, measured growl of a tracked vehicle moving with deliberate purpose through the narrow lanes that wound behind the forward positions. A Panzer IV, it turned out, had been moved up during the pre-dawn hours to support the Panzergrenadier line, and now, with the morning's first probing attacks by Canadian and British forces having settled into a temporary quiet, there came the task of coordination. This was where the real architecture of modern warfare revealed itself, not in the individual soldier's courage or skill, though those mattered deeply, but in the intricate choreography that joined infantry, armor, and supporting arms into something far more dangerous and far more fragile than any single element could be alone. A junior officer, likely a lieutenant, would have made his way to a designated meeting point with the tank's commander. They would have crouched together in a slit trench or behind a barn wall, studying a map fragment, marking distances with their fingers, discussing fields of fire and likely approaches for the next enemy thrust. How many times, one wonders, had this same conversation been rehearsed across European battlefields, and yet it never felt routine to the men who conducted it, for each iteration might be the last. The bocage, that labyrinthine landscape of thick hedgerows and sunken lanes that had made the Norman countryside so treacherous for armoured vehicles, was perhaps the worst possible terrain for executing combined arms doctrine. In the open expanses of France or Russia, a Panzer IV could dominate with its superior gun, its armour, and its mobility. It could stand off at distance, observe the battlefield in its entirety, and bring devastating fire to bear with relative safety. But here, in these narrow lanes and confined clearings, the tank's advantages compressed themselves into something far more modest. The hedgerows limited fields of view to mere dozens of meters. They channeled movement into predictable corridors that enemy gunners, whether carrying handheld anti-tank weapons or crewing infantry support guns, could easily cover. The tank's high profile made it an obvious target for any soldier patient enough to wait in the tangle of brambles and earth that rose up on either side of the lane. And yet armor was still vital. An infantry squad dug into a hedgerow, even a well-disciplined and well-armed one, would struggle terribly against a coordinated enemy assault, supported by nothing but rifles and grenades. A single machine gun positioned correctly could pin a platoon indefinitely, but add a tank, or even the threat of a tank, and the psychology shifted. The tank's gun, its weight, its noise, could break an assault or suppress enemy positions long enough for infantry to maneuver. This was the gamble of combined arms in the bocage. The tank was vulnerable, certainly, but the infantry without it was more vulnerable still. The Panzergrenadier commander had likely identified what German military doctrine called Schwerpunkt, the point of main effort, the sector of his line most likely to face attack or most critical to hold. It was there that the Panzer IV was positioned, though not right up on the forward edge where tank hunting teams could creep close, but rather a short distance back, dug in slightly to reduce its profile, its gun pointing down a lane or covering an open field that seemed a likely avenue for the enemy. The crew, 4 men usually, though sometimes 5, consisted of a commander watching the surrounding terrain, a gunner trained to aim and fire the main weapon, a loader to feed ammunition into the breech, and a driver. In some tanks, a 5th man acted as a radio operator, though in many Panzer IVs by 1944, the commander himself handled communications while managing the overall fight. One thinks of the peculiar intimacy of a tank crew operating in such close quarters, the shared stress and necessary trust. The driver could see almost nothing except through narrow viewports or, if very brave or very foolish, by throwing open his hatch. The loader and gunner worked in a space barely larger than a closet, surrounded by ammunition, breathable air growing thick with cordite smoke. The commander, hunched in his cupola, peered out at a landscape that might contain hidden anti-tank guns, Panzerfausts, or shaped charge rockets. There was very little protection from any of these threats, despite the tank's apparent solidity and weight. A well-placed shot from a Panzerschreck or Panzerfaust, those German handheld anti-tank weapons, increasingly common among Allied infantry by June 1944, could burn through armor that seemed impenetrable. How aware were these crew members of this asymmetry, one wonders? Did they sleep better or worse for knowing it? The coordination itself would have proceeded through established radio protocols, or, when radio silence was necessary, through runners, junior soldiers who would sprint between positions, carrying messages written on small slips of paper. The Panzergrenadier squads nearest the tank would have been briefed. If the enemy attacked from this direction, withdraw slightly and let the tank engage at range. If the enemy attacked from that direction, the infantry's role was to suppress any anti-tank teams or to hold ground while the tank repositioned. These plans never survived first contact intact, as military observers from von Moltke onward had noticed, but their very existence imposed structure and reduced paralysis. Soldiers who knew their role, who had practiced it however briefly, responded to crisis more quickly than those improvising. Behind this practical coordination lay decades of military theory and doctrine, the notion that armor and infantry must work in close concert, that neither was truly effective without the other in modern terrain, had emerged slowly during the First World War and crystallized during the interwar period. German military thinkers, studying their own tanks and the possibilities of rapid breakthrough, had developed this doctrine perhaps more thoroughly than any other nation. By 1944, combined arms was second nature to German junior leaders, even if the material resources to execute it perfectly were increasingly scarce. Fuel was rationed, ammunition was tight, tank replacements were slow, and yet the doctrine persisted, almost like muscle memory in a soldier's body. As 9 o'clock moved toward 10, and 10 toward 11, the Panzergrenadiers and their supporting tank waited together in the bocage. It was not dramatic waiting, but rather the long, attentive stillness of soldiers who knew that the next hours would bring another enemy probe, or perhaps, if the German High Command was feeling ambitious, a limited counterattack aimed at pushing back the British and Canadian positions. The sun climbed higher, the heat in the tank grew oppressive. In the slit trenches and behind hedgerows, men sipped at canteens of water that tasted faintly of the metal they'd been stored in. Radio operators kept their headsets on, tuned to the company frequency. Machine gunners made small adjustments to their fields of fire. The armor, sitting back in its position, represented both security and vulnerability, a magnet for enemy fire, but also a shield against assault. In the stillness, one might have observed the subordinate officers moving between positions, checking ammunition stocks, confirming that soldiers knew where they should move if ordered. It was repetitive work, but it was the work that held units together, the quiet maintenance of discipline and readiness that separated effective soldiers from merely brave ones. And somewhere in that process, the coordination between infantry and armor was happening not as a dramatic moment, but as a series of small understandings. The tank commander, noting which hedgerows provided good observation for his gunner. The Panzergrenadier platoon sergeant, confirming that his men could provide covering fire if the tank needed to reposition. These details, understood without elaborate ceremony, formed the sinews of a fighting force. By late morning, the day had assumed its own rhythm. The light was fully up now, and with it came a certain clarity, and also a certain exposure. The hedgerows that had seemed protective in the darkness revealed themselves as edges to be crossed, sightlines to be managed, dead ground to be avoided or exploited. The tank and the infantry, bound together by doctrine and necessity, settled into their roles and waited for the enemy to move next. And in that waiting, suspended between the attacks of the previous hours and whatever violence the afternoon might bring, there existed a peculiar form of rest, not physical certainly, but mental, a brief plateau of held tension before the next climb. By midday, the sun had burned through the morning fog and hung pale over the bocage, casting sharp shadows beneath the hedgerows where the Panzergrenadiers had consolidated their position. The intensity of the earlier exchange had subsided into what soldiers everywhere have learned to recognize as a lull, that peculiar exhaustion that settles over a battlefield when both sides pause to regroup, to account for losses, to breathe. The distant rumble of artillery continued its irregular percussion across the landscape, but it was far enough away now that men could unfold themselves from their slit trenches and foxholes without the immediate terror that had gripped them at dawn. The smell of cordite had begun to fade, replaced by something altogether different and strangely comforting to those who had been awake since before light touched the horizon. It was nearly 1300 hours when the order filtered quietly through the line, "Eat while you can." The men knew better than to question such an opportunity. In the bocage, hunger and thirst were chronic companions, often more relentless than enemy fire because they never stopped, never slackened. Soldiers pulled their packs closer and began the familiar ritual of opening their field rations, the tins and cardboard packets that had become the texture of their survival over the past weeks. The taste of a German military ration in 1944 was, by most accounts that have survived in letters and post-war interviews, something best consumed without too much expectation. There was a particular kind of hardtack, dense, hard biscuits issued in small portions, that required either hot water or considerable patience to soften. One could gnaw at it, and many soldiers did, developing a meditative rhythm with their jaws, each bite requiring determination and time. Some men heated water over tiny spirit lamps when conditions allowed, soaking the biscuit until it became something closer to a paste, though the flavor never truly improved. It simply became more manageable. The texture of hardtack against the roof of the mouth had a peculiar quality. It was neither unpleasant nor satisfying, merely present, a physical fact that had to be acknowledged and processed. Alongside the biscuits came tinned meat. The contents of these cans were often unmarked or deliberately obscure in their labeling, which led to considerable speculation among the men about their actual origins. Tinned pork was common, occasionally beef, though by the middle of 1944, the Reich's supply lines were beginning to show strain, and quality had become unpredictable. The meat came in a brownish, congealed state within the tin, and when opened, It released a smell that was neither fresh nor entirely unpleasant, a kind of salted, preserved funk that spoke to long months of storage. It was, after all, designed to remain edible, regardless of temperature, moisture, or circumstance. Such resilience came at a cost to the sensory experience. A man named Friedrich Müller, whose letters were discovered in 1989 in a Bavarian archive, wrote to his sister in Hamburg about the peculiar meditation of eating field rations during a lull in fighting. He described the taste as like chewing leather that has been boiled in salt and regret, but he also noted that hunger made one grateful for almost anything solid. When the body has been awake and alert for many hours, when the nervous system has been flooded with adrenaline and fear, the actual flavor of food becomes almost secondary to the simple fact of its presence and warmth. The men around this particular hedgerow position in Normandy fell into the quiet pattern of eating with deliberation. A young grenadier named Klaus, barely 19 years old, sat with his tin balanced on his knee, using his knife to carve small portions from the congealed meat, pairing each bite with a piece of hardtack that he had soaked briefly in his canteen. He had a letter in his pocket from his mother, received just before the unit moved to the front, and while he ate, he kept his eyes on the hedgerow opposite, watching for any movement that might suggest the pause was ending. The letter spoke of the orchard near his home where the apple trees were blooming. He had not seen that orchard in 3 years. The tinned vegetables, when included in a ration pack, offered a texture that was softer, but somehow more melancholy than the meat. Carrots and beans, reduced to pulp by the canning process and months of transport, mushed against the tongue without providing much sensory satisfaction. They were orange or pale green, depending on which tin you had opened, and they carried a faint vinegary scent that some soldiers welcomed as a break from the sameness of everything else. A few men carried small amounts of pepper or salt crystals wrapped in paper, and these became precious beyond measure during such moments. Transformed into small rituals of enhancement and control, the ability to alter one's food was a small assertion of agency in a situation where nearly everything was dictated. The chocolate, when it appeared in a ration, was treated with reverence. German military chocolate was compact, dense, meant to provide calories and fat in an economical package. It had a waxy quality that persisted even as it melted on the tongue, and in the warmth of a June Normandy afternoon, it did indeed melt quickly. Some soldiers saved their chocolate rations, hoarding them against future moments of despair, or, in some cases, trading them for cigarettes or other items their neighbors valued more. A piece of chocolate consumed slowly, made to last 10 or 15 minutes through deliberate licking and small bites, became a small meditation on time and patience. There was also, in certain ration packs, a form of hard candy or lozenge, meant to provide quick energy and, perhaps, a small gesture toward morale. These candies were often peppermint-flavored, and they became associated in the minds of many soldiers with moments of rest and the fragile hope that the present lull might extend into something longer. The actual mechanics of eating during a military engagement, even during such a lull, involved a kind of attentiveness that cannot be overstated. A soldier never ate with both hands fully occupied, never allowed his awareness of his surroundings to soften completely into the simple pleasure of consumption. One hand held food, the other remained near a weapon or ready to grip a rifle. The eyes maintained their pattern of observation, the ears remained tuned to the soundscape. Eating, in this context, was not a moment of rest so much as a moment of parallel activity, fueling the body while the mind remained engaged in the work of survival. The thirst was, in some ways, more pressing than the hunger. Water was precious, carried in canteens that were often heavy and cumbersome, but never quite full enough. The water itself had a metallic taste, sometimes a faint chemical tang from purification tablets that made it unpalatable. Men drank it anyway, because the alternative, thirst that intensified through the afternoon as the sun climbed higher, was unacceptable. The combination of fear, exertion, and tension dried the mouth in a way that seemed almost pathological. Some soldiers chewed on grass or leaves, seeking moisture. Some allowed small quantities of saliva to accumulate before swallowing, a technique they had learned in training or discovered through necessity. During this midday lull, perhaps 2 hours of relative quiet, the Panzergrenadiers ate their rations with the efficiency of men who understood that opportunity was temporary. They did not know yet that the afternoon would bring another engagement, that the consolidation they were making would prove temporary, that by evening they would be withdrawing to a secondary position. They ate with the assumption that this was a pause within an ongoing situation, not a conclusion to anything. The taste of hardtack and tinned meat, the texture of long-preserved vegetables, the small pleasure of chocolate consumed slowly, these sensations anchored them in the present moment, gave their bodies something concrete to process besides fear. Around them, the bocage remained as it had been, the high hedgerows, the tangled roots, the damp earth that never quite dried. A light breeze moved through the hedge, carrying the smell of crushed grass and, faintly, something sweeter from a distant orchard where apple blossoms were still falling. The sky, visible only in fragments through the interlocking branches, remained the pale blue of late spring. Artillery rumbled on the horizon, a sound that had become so constant that its absence would have seemed unusual. But here, in this small pocket of space where men sat with their rations and their thoughts, there was something approaching quietness. The human body, when given even a brief reprieve from the demands of combat alertness, begins to seek normalcy. Eating is one of the most fundamental acts of normalcy that exists. It carries within it an implicit statement that the world is continuing, that the future extends beyond the next few minutes, that there is a point to sustaining oneself. A soldier eating field rations during a lull in fighting is, in a quiet way, making an act of faith. He is saying, through the simple mechanics of lifting food to his mouth and consuming it, that he believes he will need the energy that food provides. Whether that belief is justified, or whether it is merely a necessary illusion, is a question that perhaps only the soldiers themselves could answer, and even then, perhaps not with certainty. By 1330 hours, the ration packs were nearly empty, the tins folded and placed back into packs, or, in some cases, buried in small holes to avoid leaving traces of the position's location. The men took what water they could, and as the afternoon light began its subtle shift toward the longer shadows of later day, they settled back into their positions with the resigned patience that comes from knowing the lull would not last. The taste of hardtack and tinned meat would linger in their mouths, a sensory reminder that they had eaten, that they had paused, that they had existed for a few hours in something that approximated peace. The sun was climbing higher now, and with it came a particular kind of anxiety that the soldiers of the Panzergrenadier unit had learned to recognize in their chests and shoulders before they heard a single engine. The Allies, by the summer of 1944, owned the sky above Normandy almost completely. The Luftwaffe had largely withdrawn from daylight operations, and what remained of German air cover was scattered, occasional, and often too distant to matter. This meant that during daylight hours, from roughly dawn until dusk, the men in the hedgerows and sunken lanes lived under a threat that was both omnipresent and intermittent, which in some ways made it psychologically more exhausting than a concentrated bombardment would have been. You could prepare for a scheduled attack, you could brace yourself, but the fighter bombers came unpredictably, often at the edge of hearing first, a distant drone that might mean danger or might mean nothing at all. The sound, when it came clearly, was distinctive. The Thunderbolt, the Americans called it, the P-47, a heavy-bodied fighter with a peculiar aggressive roar that the German soldiers had come to dread above almost every other noise of the battlefield. These aircraft arrived in formations sometimes, but more often in pairs or small flights, searching for movement along the roads, for truck convoys, for concentrations of men, for anything that suggested a viable target. The British and Canadians flew the Spitfire and the Typhoon, the latter carrying rockets that could tear through armor and flesh with equal indifference. When a Panzergrenadier heard that sound rising from the horizon, There was perhaps a 3-minute window, sometimes less, to take cover or to pray that the aircraft would pass over without noticing. Those were long minutes, stretched thin by adrenaline and helplessness. What made this threat so peculiarly draining, historians have noted in the diaries and letters that survive from men in similar units, was the psychological quality of yielding control entirely to an enemy you could barely touch. Anti-aircraft guns existed, certainly, but they were sparse and usually positioned miles away at divisional or corps command level. The individual soldier had no weapon that reached the sky. He could only dig deeper, crouch lower, and wait. The fear was not entirely of death, though that was present. It was of randomness, of the arbitrariness of survival. A bomb or rocket might fall 5 meters away and miss you entirely, or it might fall 50 meters away and catch you with fragments traveling faster than sound. There was no merit to it, no fairness, no reward for vigilance or bravery. The psychological toll accumulated in ways that are difficult to measure, but that emerge clearly in the testimony of survivors. Sleep became even more fragmented than combat ordinarily made it, because even when a man lay down to rest after hours of standing watch, the dread of being caught unprepared never fully lifted. The startle reflex, the sudden tensing and alertness that comes from a loud noise, became almost reflexive. A soldier's nervous system, primed by weeks of this threat, would jolt awake at the sound of an approaching truck kilometers away, mistaking it for the approach of engines above. Some men developed a kind of learned paralysis, a fatalistic numbness that was perhaps a mercy in small doses, but that also indicated a deeper depletion of the will to survive. One particular aspect of this air threat deserves quiet consideration: the effect it had on unit cohesion and command structure. Officers and NCOs had to continue making tactical decisions in the midst of this ambient terror. A squad leader might be ordered to move his men across an open space to reinforce a flank or to recover wounded, and he would have to do so while watching the sky, while calculating risk, while knowing that an enemy pilot several thousand meters above might at any moment decide that his position was worth a burst of machine gun fire or the release of ordnance. This created a peculiar form of stress that was distinct from the stress of direct infantry combat, because there was an additional layer of helplessness, an extra dimension of powerlessness that men had to somehow manage while still functioning as soldiers. The fighter bombers also shaped the tactical landscape itself. Roads became less useful, columns had to scatter and take to the woods and hedgerows. This made resupply slower, logistics more fragmented. Daylight movement, which might have seemed like an operational advantage, became a liability because moving men and vehicles in daylight meant exposure to air attack. This constraint rippled through every decision that commanders had to make about where to position their units, when to consolidate defensive positions, when to attempt offensive actions. By the nature of working against this invisible threat, Panzergrenadier units and the divisions to which they belonged had to operate in ways that seemed almost to turn the rules of modern warfare on their head. Darkness became safer than daylight, static defense more appealing than mobile assault. In the medical records and casualty reports that survive from this period, there is evidence that the psychological strain of air attack accounted for a significant proportion of the non-lethal casualties that units suffered. Men developed what was then called Nervenschock, or what might today be recognized as acute stress reaction: trembling, inability to concentrate, sudden dissociation, temporary loss of hearing or sight that had no physical cause, but that was no less real for being psychological in origin. The battalion surgeons and medics did what they could, but there was no real treatment except rest and removal from the immediate threat, and removal from the line was often not possible when units were severely under strength and engaged with the enemy. What is particularly poignant about this dimension of the Normandy campaign is that it was inflicted upon both sides. The Allies too suffered from German air attack where it occurred, though far less frequently and less severely. But the asymmetry of air power meant that the weight of this particular psychological burden fell overwhelmingly on the German side. The Panzergrenadiers could see, on clear days, the contrails of Allied bombers heading inland toward targets they could not defend. They could hear the distant rumble of strategic bombing campaigns against German cities and installations. They could know, with absolute certainty, that the sky itself was an enemy that could not be fought. In the quiet hours of midday, as the unit settled into temporary positions and men ate their rations and tried to rest, this threat hung over everything like a physical presence. It was invisible but omnipresent. It did not attack every moment, but it might attack at any moment, and that distinction between the certain danger and the uncertain timing created a form of vigilance that was nearly impossible to sustain for long periods. Yet sustained it had to be, because the only alternative was to abandon the positions entirely, and that was not an option that these soldiers had been given. The noon sun, when it finally burned through the dissipating fog, seemed almost indifferent to what was unfolding below the hedgerows. The temperature had crept into the low 60s, and along the German positions, men had begun to shed their field jackets, though no one wandered far from cover. The smell of heated metal and disturbed earth hung in the air, a smell that soldiers learned, over time, not to notice anymore. Or perhaps it became part of their breathing, inseparable from survival itself. By 11:30, the radio net had crackled with a report that would not have surprised anyone who had spent the previous 72 hours in the bocage. Movement had been spotted 200 meters to the northwest, across the Norman fields, where the hedgerows formed a natural corridor toward their line. The spotter, a young grenadier lying in a forward position with binoculars and a field telephone, had described it in the flat, measured tones of someone who had learned to separate emotion from information. Vehicles, infantry in dispersed formation, the Canadians perhaps, or the British from the lines further east. There was no way to be certain until they came closer, and by then, certainty would be less important than reaction. The company commander, a man in his late 20s whose name survives only in fragments, captured documents, a photograph in a Heidelberg archive, had moved along the firing line, speaking quietly to his squad leaders. No heroic speeches, no rallying cries, simply a restatement of what each man already knew. Hold the position, conserve ammunition, let the attackers come into effective range before returning fire. The standard geometry of defense in the bocage, a geometry that neither side had yet learned to break decisively. What made the bocage so murderous was precisely what made it so confusing. The thick hedgerows, grown over centuries as field boundaries, created a landscape of blind corners and perpendicular sightlines. A man defending a hedgerow could see perhaps 100 meters in either direction before the vegetation swallowed vision entirely. An attacker could advance through sunken lanes and copses without being observed until the very moment he emerged into an open field, at which point he became, briefly, terrifyingly visible. How many seconds would that be? 5? 10? Enough to fire 3 or 4 rounds from a Kar 98K rifle, or longer bursts from the MG-34 machine gun that anchored the squad's firepower. The mathematics of this terrible equation had been worked out in blood across every battlefield of the European theatre, and yet no one had found a way to solve it cleanly. The first indication that the attack was moving forward came not as a visual thing, but as a change in the air itself. The birds had fallen silent. They always did, before. Then, the faint percussion of mortar tubes firing from somewhere beyond the far hedgerow. The sound carried across the fields with an odd, almost musical quality, a sound that men in 1944 learned to interpret with precision, born of weeks of exposure. Not heavy fire, not yet. Illumination mortars, and perhaps smoke. The British and Canadians had grown sophisticated about their approach by mid-June. They understood that a direct assault across open ground invited massacre. The smoke, when it began to drift across the German positions, smelled faintly of phosphorus, chemical, acrid, nothing like anything found in nature. It rolled in white tendrils, not thick enough to obscure vision entirely, but sufficient to create doubt. In the thickness of that uncertainty, the first figures began to appear, moving through the nearest hedgerow crossing. British uniforms, from what could be discerned through the murk. The distinctive silhouettes of Enfield rifles, perhaps 20 men in the first wave, advancing in a leapfrog pattern that the grenadiers recognized instantly as the product of months of training and dozens of previous assaults. The question that formed, unbidden, in the minds of the German defenders was one that had no comfortable answer. Would today be the day when superior numbers finally overwhelmed superior discipline? The bocage was a weapon that worked both ways. It protected them as much as it protected their attackers. But it also meant that they would never see the full scope of the enemy force until it was too late to flee or reinforce. The machine gunner, a 34-year-old conscript from the Rhineland, whose wife had written to him 3 weeks earlier about the cherry harvest at her brother's farm, adjusted his aim point. His assistant kept his eyes on the ammunition belt, ensuring that no twist or kink would jam at the critical moment. These were not men consumed by ideology or fervent belief. They were men doing a job, performing the mechanical rituals they had rehearsed 1,000 times in training, now applying them to the reality of smoke and movement, and the presence of people who meant them harm. The distance closed. 150 meters. 100. The smoke was thinning now, the mortars had ceased, and the wind was naturally dispersing what remained. The British infantry, sensing the threshold approaching, began to move faster. A few figures broke into a low run, bent at the waist, rifles raised. Others remained in place, providing covering fire with their weapons, though at this range, their fire was more psychological than effective. The Germans held their line, fingers on triggers, waiting for the authorization that only the squad leader could give. What no one expected, perhaps, was the sound. Not the sound of the attack itself, but the sound that came from above. The roar of piston engines, drawing swiftly closer from the south and east. In the span of perhaps 3 seconds, the entire calculus of the moment shifted. The British attack, which had been building towards something decisive, faltered. Soldiers dropped into the hedgerows, seeking any concealment they could find. The Royal Air Force, it seemed, had decided to take an interest in the proceedings. The German defenders, paradoxically, were nearly as vulnerable as their attackers. The bocage offered cover from ground fire, but not from the sky, and so in the minutes that followed, something resembling a mutual pause occurred, both sides attempting to make themselves small, to become part of the landscape, to minimize their profile against the horizon. The Spitfires or Typhoons, the soldiers below could rarely tell the difference, could only listen to that distinctive mechanical shriek and feel the impact of whatever ordnance the aircraft chose to release. Made several passes, though whether they scored hits was difficult to determine from the ground level. The explosions, when they came, seemed always to be occurring slightly wrong, slightly off, from where one thought an aircraft ought to have been aiming. By the time the aircraft departed, drawn away by radio calls summoning them to other pressing emergencies in other sectors, the British attack had lost its momentum entirely. The assault formations, which moments before had seemed so purposeful and coordinated, had fragmented into small groups of men attempting to extricate themselves from their current positions or consolidate gains they had managed to make. A few had pushed closer to the German hedgerow, close enough that the distance had become personal, intimate even. But the numbers did not favor further advance, and the radio net, when it crackled to life again, communicated orders for the attacking force to consolidate and await support. The grenadiers, for their part, did not cheer or celebrate. They did what soldiers in every war have done, in the moments following an action that did not develop as anticipated. They took account, they checked their ammunition, they looked at their comrades to ensure that all were accounted for. A few lit cigarettes, the sharp smell of German tobacco, a scent many soldiers would carry in their memory for the rest of their lives. And somewhere, in a farmhouse 2 kilometers to the rear, a runner was dispatched to headquarters with the message that the attack had been repulsed, for the moment, and that the position remained held. The afternoon stretched before them, unknowable and full of waiting. Somewhere in the smoke and noise, where the hedgerows had been torn open by shell fire, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath between volleys. There moved figures in a different sort of uniform. Not riflemen, not tank crews, men marked not by what they carried to fight, but by what they carried to save. The stretcher-bearers of both sides, German and Allied alike, occupied a peculiar and haunting space in the daily arithmetic of a battle like Normandy. They moved through the same terrain, breathed the same cordite and dust, heard the same incoming whistle of artillery, yet carried with them a different kind of weight, a weight that was sometimes heavier because it was human and conscious and fighting against the very machinery of destruction that surrounded them. In German Panzergrenadier units, the Sanitäter, as they were called, typically operated in pairs or small teams attached to each platoon. One man with medical training, often just a few months of field instruction, though some were former nurses or doctors conscripted into service, and an assistant, usually the youngest, the one with the steadiest hands and the quietest temperament. They carried what little they could manage, field dressings, perhaps some morphine in ampule form if they were fortunate enough, a tourniquet, bandages that had been washed and reused so many times, the cloth had grown thin and nearly translucent. By mid-1944, in a unit that had been absorbing casualties for weeks, supplies were running low, and the Sanitäter often found himself rationing even the most basic medicines, making choices about who received what care based on calculations no one should have to make. There is something historians have come to understand more clearly over the decades, through letters and survivor accounts, and the careful piecing together of regimental records. The medics on both sides, the German stretcher-bearers and the Allied combat medics, often American or Canadian, marked with their Red Cross armbands. These men frequently made a silent pact with one another. When a man fell and a medic came running toward him through open ground, exposed to fire, the opposing side sometimes held their fire, not always, not universally, but often enough that it became one of the few unspoken courtesies that survived the industrial brutality of modern warfare. One can imagine the psychological toll this must have placed on a young German medic, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, trained in Hitler Youth doctrine, but now confronted daily with the reality that the enemy, the Western capitalist armies he had been taught were subhuman, could show mercy, could lower their rifles and allow a man in a white armband to drag a wounded comrade to safety. What did that do to the certainties he had been given? The stretcher-bearers' war was a different kind of horror from the infantryman's. The infantry soldier fought. He returned fire. He had moments of agency, of exerting will against the chaos. The medic could only move towards suffering, knowing that his own life hung on the goodwill of men who moments before had been trying to kill him. And when he reached a wounded man, what could he actually do? In the bocage, with shells still falling, with the patient sometimes too far gone, sometimes young enough to be someone's brother or son, the Sanitäter had to stop the bleeding he could stop, comfort the dying he could not, and then move on to the next one, and the next, knowing that his bag of supplies would not stretch far enough. What survives of this experience, in archives and in the memories of those who lived through it, are fragments. A few letters, perhaps, where a medic writes home about the weight of it, though military censorship often prevented soldiers from saying too much. There are also, more rarely, accounts from both sides describing moments where a German medic and an American medic encountered one another, sometimes across the bodies of the fallen, and acknowledged each other with a nod, a gesture that said, "We are both doing what we can in this impossible place." The German half-tracks that moved men forward also sometimes served as makeshift ambulances on the way back. The SDKFZ 251, which could carry a full Panzergrenadier squad of 10 men, might return to battalion aid stations with only a handful aboard, the remaining space filled with stretchers, with wounded who would not fire another shot that day, if ever. The drivers of these vehicles, ferrying casualties back, were engaged in their own kind of courage, operating in slow, vulnerable progress toward the rear, exposed to the same air attacks and artillery that fell on anyone moving through Normandy's terrible bocage. There is a photograph, or perhaps several from this period, German and Allied medics are sometimes visible in the background of combat photographs, kneeling beside the fallen, their actions frozen in black and white. These images are difficult to look at, not because they show explicit gore, but because they capture the moment when destruction meets the human reflex to help, when a young man, often poorly trained, often terrified, is forced to become the only thing standing between another young man and oblivion. One wonders, and the historical record invites this wondering, how many lives were saved by the Sanitäter of the 12th SS Panzer Division and units like it, men who were serving in Hitler's army, but who, in the moment of actual contact with wound and blood and suffering, sometimes transcended the ideology they had been given and simply tried to keep another human being alive. And how many of those medics, in turn, were killed trying to do so, struck by shrapnel or small arms fire while running toward danger that everyone else was running away from. The stretcher bearer's experience suggests something that deeper historical understanding sometimes arrives at quietly, that even in the most ideologically fractured and morally compromised military organizations, individual human beings retained the capacity for mercy. The Sanitäter could not change the war, could not stop the tanks or the artillery, or the endless cycle of attack and withdrawal, but in those moments when he knelt beside a fallen Panzergrenadier, or, in some cases, even beside a captured Allied soldier, he was making a choice. A small, personal choice that existed outside the apparatus of state and ideology and military command. By the afternoon hours, as the fighting in the hedgerows continued its grinding progression, the work of the medics had likely increased, the demands on their small supplies intensified. The forward aid stations, usually established behind the company defensive line, would have accumulated their own weight of casualties, men waiting for transport to battalion aid posts or field hospitals further to the rear. The soundscape of these places would have been different from the rifle pits and machine gun positions, quieter in some ways, punctuated by groans and whispered requests for water, by the soft reassurances of medics who had perhaps already seen more suffering in a few weeks than most men encounter in a lifetime. The afternoon light had begun its slow descent when the order came through, relayed quietly from one foxhole to the next, passed along in murmurs that carried the weight of inevitability. Pull back. Secondary positions, 200 meters to the rear, toward the tree line where the ground rose slightly and offered better sight lines and, more crucially, the possibility of resupply. The men who had been holding this hedgerow since dawn understood without needing to be told that this was not a temporary repositioning. This was what retreat looked like in the bocage, not the headlong routes of earlier campaigns, but a deliberate, contested withdrawal, measured step by step, with no certainty about what came next. The first challenge was ammunition. By mid-afternoon of a day like this one, a Panzergrenadier squad that had been engaged for 6 or 7 hours was running low on rifle cartridges. The MG-42 gunner was counting his remaining belts with the kind of careful arithmetic that soldiers perform when supply lines are stretched thin or broken entirely. By the summer of 1944, the German logistics network in Normandy was under extraordinary strain. The railways had been systematically destroyed in the months before the invasion. The roads leading south and east toward the landing zones were choked with wreckage and crawling with Allied fighter bombers that seemed to appear whenever more than 3 or 4 vehicles moved together. A single ammunition truck making the journey from supply depots near Caen to the front lines was as likely to arrive in fragments as it was to arrive intact. What this meant, in practice, was a mathematics of scarcity that shaped every decision made by officers and NCOs. How many rounds could an MG-42 actually afford to fire in a sustained engagement before running dry? 30, 40 bursts? After that, was it better to conserve and rely on rifles, or was the psychological and tactical advantage of the machine gun worth depleting the reserve? These were the calculations that Panzergrenadier squad leaders, many of them teenagers or men in their early 20s who had received only months of training before being funneled into Normandy, now had to make in real time. There was no textbook answer. There was only the exhausted pragmatism of men trying to survive an afternoon. The withdrawal itself required discipline that should not be taken for granted. It is easy to imagine withdrawal as panic, as soldiers abandoning positions and running for the rear. The reality, when it worked, was closer to choreography, one fire team covering while another moved, then stopping and establishing a new line while the first team withdrew through and past them, a controlled leapfrog that required trust and training and a willingness to stay calm when instinct screamed to run. The bocage, for all its constraints and claustrophobia, actually favored this kind of fighting. The thick hedgerows provided natural fallback positions every 100 meters or so, a defending force that knew the terrain could choose where to make a stand and where to cede ground, and the attackers, in this case the British and Canadians pressing from the north, had to clear each position, which was slow, attritional work. But there was always the question of fuel. The half-tracks that had carried the Panzergrenadiers forward in the morning and that were now supposed to help facilitate the withdrawal to the secondary line were themselves dependent on supply trucks that were subject to the same disruptions, the same air attacks, the same bottlenecks at damaged bridges and flooded crossings. A SDKFZ 251 half-track, standard transport for Panzergrenadier squads, burned fuel at a steady rate whether it was moving or stationary. By afternoon, drivers were beginning to eye their fuel gauges with the kind of anxiety that only scarcity produces. Could they make the withdrawal? Could they position themselves in support of the new line, or would they run dry halfway there and become immobilized targets, easy prey for artillery spotters or fighter bombers if the Allies managed to establish air superiority over this particular stretch of bocage in the next few hours? These were not dramatic concerns. They do not lend themselves to sweeping narratives of heroism or tragedy, but they shaped the afternoon with their quiet presence, a background hum of anxiety beneath the larger decisions being made. An officer, perhaps a Hauptsturmführer, a captain, responsible for the withdrawal of 2 or 3 squads, had to know how much ammunition his men actually had, what his half-tracks could carry, whether they could relocate their wounded, and whether the new positions to the rear had actually been prepared, or whether that was wishful thinking from whoever had issued the order. The answer to most of these questions, in the summer of 1944, was, "We don't know yet, we'll find out when we get there." The physical act of movement began in the mid-afternoon, once the covering fire had been arranged and the first team was ready to shift. Weapons were shouldered, ammunition pouches were checked one final time, and men began moving backward through the hedgerows, bent low, moving from one shadow to another, always keeping sight of the hedgerow ahead, so that they knew where to go if the covering fire suddenly became urgent. The German soldier did not have the luxury, in this moment, of thinking too far ahead. His world had compressed to the next 50 meters, the next hedgerow, the sound of the machine gun behind him still providing suppressive fire. The pace was slow. There was no running. Running meant you were panicking, and panicking meant mistakes, and mistakes meant casualties that the medics, already busy with wounded from the morning's fighting, could not afford. Behind them, the covering squad remained in place a moment longer, the MG-42 gunner holding his fire to conserve what ammunition remained, making every burst count, rationing it like a man rationing water in a desert. When he finally received the signal that the withdrawing squad had reached the secondary line and was ready to provide covering fire in turn, he and his men would move, and the whole careful dance would repeat itself. This was what withdrawal looked like. It was not collapse. It was not rout. It was the steady, contested bleeding backward of a force that had lost the initiative but had not yet lost the ability to inflict casualties and buy time with terrain and discipline. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the new positions were beginning to take shape. Shovels, carried by every Panzergrenadier, were already biting into the earth of the secondary line. The half-tracks, those that had fuel enough, were positioning themselves for overwatch and rapid reinforcement if a sudden attack came. But there was an exhaustion settling over the men now, a bone-deep tiredness that no amount of caffeine, the ersatz coffee they'd had at dawn, was long digested, could penetrate. They had been awake since well before dawn. They had been under fire, or expecting to be under fire, for most of the day. Their uniforms were soaked with a mixture of sweat, dust, and the dampness that the bocage seemed to retain, no matter what the weather was doing. Their minds were foggy with fatigue and adrenaline, that peculiar combination that soldiers call the shakes, and they were now, once again, trying to dig in, to prepare positions that might or might not need to be held, in a battle that they knew, in some unspoken way, they could not ultimately win. The mathematics of scarcity was becoming the mathematics of futility. By 1700 hours, as the afternoon light began its final descent, the secondary line was as ready as it would ever be, and the waiting began again. While the German soldiers dug deeper into their secondary positions that afternoon, their boots pressing into earth that had belonged to the same families for generations, the people who actually lived here were moving through a different kind of horror altogether. The Normandy bocage, for all its tactical utility to defenders, was also someone's home. Small farms carved out of limestone ridges, apple orchards that had produced cider for centuries, villages where the baker's name had been the same for 3 generations, and the church bells had rung for weddings and funerals in unbroken sequence since the Middle Ages. By mid-June 1944, all of that continuity had shattered like glass. The farmers of Normandy had already endured 4 years of occupation. The Wehrmacht had requisitioned their grain, their livestock, their young men as labourers. The Norman dialect that had persisted for so long had become almost a liability. German soldiers struggled with it, and the French authorities from Paris sometimes looked down on these rural people as provincial, stubborn, not quite modern enough. But occupation, however harsh, had at least achieved a kind of grim stability. A farmer knew his obligations. He knew roughly what would be taken. There was an exhausting predictability to survival. And then came the invasion, and everything compressed into absolute chaos. The bombardment that had pounded the bocage in the weeks before D-Day was meant to disrupt German reinforcements, to cut roads and railways, to break supply lines before they could reach the beach. But maps drawn in distant headquarters rarely account for the texture of human lives beneath them. The bombing came to hamlets that had never done anything to anyone. It came to farmhouses where children slept. The Allies dropped roughly 5 times more tonnage on Normandy than on Hamburg, and much of that fell not on carefully chosen military targets, but on the dense inhabited farmland where the bocage's defensive strength lay. Consider the experience of a family in a village like Saint-Lô or Caen as summer 1944 arrived. If they fled eastward, they moved toward more German lines, toward ongoing shelling, toward the possibility of being caught in crossfire. If they fled westward toward the American sector, they encountered different dangers, different languages, different rules of engagement, the possibility of being mistaken for German sympathizers, or of being caught in combat between advancing Americans and retreating Germans. Staying put meant sheltering in a cellar while the world above transformed into something unrecognizable. The roof might be torn away, the barn might burn, the fields, so carefully worked and tended, might be churned into mud, mined, or declared a military zone where civilians could not venture. There is a particular loneliness in that kind of displacement. The knowledge that your suffering, real as it is not quite anyone's priority. The soldiers fighting around you were thinking about survival, about orders, about home. The occupying powers were thinking about strategy. The liberating powers were thinking about victory. And the farmer, standing in whatever remained of his farmyard, was simply trying to remember where his wife's sister had gone, whether the cows had made it into the forest, whether the grain stored in the eastern barn was still intact or had been buried under rubble. The Normandy campaign would displace something like 800,000 people over its duration, roughly a third of the region's population. Villages like Villedieu-les-Bailleul, Grain, and dozens of others were essentially erased, not by deliberate act of destruction, but by the mathematics of war. Artillery shells and tank rounds do not distinguish between military installations and the stone houses where families have lived. Civilians were killed in numbers that historians still debate, but certainly in the thousands. The estimates climb depending on whose records you trust and how you count those who died of illness or injury in the months after displacement, separated from medical care, living in makeshift camps. What survived, in surprising abundance, were letters. Soldiers on both sides wrote home, the Germans to families in the Reich, the Allies to sweethearts and mothers, and siblings scattered across North America and Britain. But there is another class of testimony that emerges from Normandy's archives, the letters and journals of the civilians themselves, often written in the moment, often fragmentary and incomplete, but achingly present. A woman in Bayeux, watching from her cellar window as tanks rumbled past. A farmer, trying to account for missing livestock in a brief note to his brother. A schoolteacher, noting how many of her students had simply vanished, evacuated by their parents towards somewhere safer. These accounts, when historians have been patient enough to collect them, reveal something more textured than simple victimhood. Yes, there was terror and loss. But there was also a kind of stubborn determination. Normandy's peasants had survived feudalism, wars, famines, and revolution. They had learned to say little to occupiers and less to liberators. They shared information quietly. They hid people, German deserters, escaped prisoners, sometimes Allied soldiers who'd become separated from their units. They tried to protect what could be protected and to salvage what could be salvaged from the wreckage. The bocage itself, that landscape that had sheltered the defending armies, also became shelter for the displaced. Families would retreat into the thick hedgerows, dig small shelters beneath the roots and branches, live for days or weeks in that green, damp darkness, listening to artillery rumble above. The very terrain that made the fighting so bitter and so prolonged was also what kept many people alive. It offered hiding places when the bombs fell, spaces between the warfare where, briefly, you could breathe. By the afternoon of June 17th, as the German unit you have been moving through all day consolidated its secondary position, the roads around them were clogged, not just with military traffic, but with civilians walking in all directions. Some pushed handcarts with what they'd managed to salvage. Others carried nothing but children, walking with the kind of mechanical exhaustion that comes after several nights without real sleep. The soldiers, some of them barely older than the children they passed, had their own survival to think about. But in the letters that survived the war, you find small notations, human moments. A Panzergrenadier noting the sad face of a girl by a destroyed barn, an observation so brief it barely registers before he returns to describing his own fear or hunger. The true measure of war is often not in the military records but in this, the displacement of the ordinary, the interruption of continuity, the knowledge held by a farmer standing in what was once his field that he might never see it the same way again. The Normandy bocage would, in fact, slowly return to peacetime. The hedgerows would grow back or be replanted. The villages would be rebuilt, often with modern concrete replacing medieval stone. Families would return, generations later, to farms their ancestors had owned, and they would tell their children about the summer everything changed. But the peace that came was never quite the same peace that had existed before. And something in the texture of that landscape, in the character of those communities, had been worn smooth by fire and displacement and the knowledge of how fragile continuity really is. The afternoon light had begun its slow drain toward the western ridge, turning the bocage a deeper, more complicated green. The shelling had lessened, as it often did in the hours before dusk, as if both sides drew breath at the same moment, and the men of the Panzergrenadier squad were moving now with the particular exhaustion that comes not from a single blow, but from the weight of many small ones pressed down hour after hour. Their muscles moved almost of their own accord, muscle memory and discipline carrying them through the motions of consolidation that would unfold across the next few hours. The order came down quietly, passed from squad leader to team leader to the men in the line. Dig in. They had fallen back perhaps 200 meters during the afternoon withdrawal, and now they would establish a secondary position along a shallow sunken lane that offered some natural defilade, a word that meant the slope and the earth itself would shield them from direct fire. It was one of the small mercies of bocage warfare, if mercy could be found in any of it. The lane's banks were already 3 feet high in places, darkened by dampness and the roots of centuries-old hawthorn and oak, and the men began at once with their spades, deepening what nature and Norman farmers had already provided. One of the younger soldiers, perhaps 19, with the pale face of someone who had lived most of his life in the city, drove his spade into the earth with a kind of controlled fury, not anger exactly, but the need to move, to create something solid between himself and the sky where the enemy aircraft came from. He worked in silence, as most of them did during the digging, a silence that came not from discipline alone, but from the peculiar exhaustion that made speech feel like lifting a heavy stone. Around him, other men scraped and shoveled, deepening firing positions, clearing fields of fire by removing lower branches from the hedgerow, creating small gaps where a rifle or a machine gun could bear down the lane toward the approaches to the east. Darkness, when it came in Normandy that time of year, did not come all at once but in subtle increments, a slow theft of detail. The Germans, if they could be called such, though most of these men were German only by official designation, many from the occupied territories, some conscripted and some volunteer, but nearly all caught in machinery larger than themselves, worked by the diminishing light until they could no longer see precisely what they were doing. Then they stopped, posted sentries, and began the quieter business of settling into the night. It was in these liminal hours, as the last colour drained from the sky and before the full darkness took hold, that something softer emerged from the men. The fighting might resume at any moment, might not come again until dawn or later, but for now there was a temporary reprieve from the acuteness of danger, and in that reprieve, conversation began. Not loud, never loud. Sound discipline was too deeply ingrained, and the knowledge that a careless voice might draw fire was written into their bones. But quiet talk, murmured exchanges as men settled into their positions, shared cigarettes that glowed pale and brief in the gathering dark, unwrapped packages of kommissbrot, the dark bread that was the foundation of every day. One man, perhaps a Gefreiter, a lance corporal with a few years of service before this, was writing a letter by the last available light, balancing a small piece of paper on his knee, his pencil moving slowly. What could be written in such circumstances? How could anyone describe the weight of a day like this day had been? The waiting, the sudden violence, the withdrawal, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same patterns in some new variation. He wrote anyway, in small, careful script, words meant for his mother in Stuttgart, or his wife in Berlin, or his sister in Munich, some fragment of himself on paper that might, by miracle, reach across the distance and touch someone who loved him. The envelope, when he sealed it, bore his unit number and his rank, a small formality that acknowledged the possibility he might not be there to post it himself. How many such letters were written, one might wonder, across how many nights in the bocage? The archives contain some of them, preserved in military records or personal collections, and they follow patterns that are achingly consistent: small homesickness, practical concerns about packages and rations, assurances of being well and in good spirits that hardly anyone believed while writing them. There is a kind of code in soldiers' letters, a language of restraint and understatement that allowed men to reach toward those they loved without burdening them with truth too terrible to hold. Another soldier was simply sitting, his back against the deepened bank of the lane, smoking a cigarette, with the manner of someone who had learned to make each one last. Beside him sat another, perhaps his friend of several weeks or several years. It was hard to say in units that had suffered heavy casualties and replacement. They spoke in the low register of voices worn smooth by tiredness. "Do you think they'll come again tonight?" the second man asked, and it was the kind of question that had no answer and yet required asking, the need to voice fear being sometimes the only way to bear it. Perhaps in the morning. The smoking man paused, drew on his cigarette, exhaled slowly. "It does not matter much. does it? We are here, and they are there, and tomorrow we will do the same things again. This is the conversation of fatalism, not despair exactly, but a kind of resignation that settles on soldiers when they have begun to understand that events move according to logic larger than their own choices or wishes. It is not unique to the Waffen-SS, this particular exhaustion. Men in Canadian trenches across the way were having similar conversations, in English, with the same drift toward acceptance of the incomprehensible machinery that had caught them. But there is something worth noting, quietly, about the particular composition of this unit. The mixture of ideological volunteers, conscripts, foreigners absorbed into German service, and young men barely old enough to have much ideology at all. They had been shaped by different forces, pulled toward different centers of gravity, and yet here they sat in the dark, very much the same in their weariness. The Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth Organization, had been a primary pipeline for many of these younger men, and one cannot discuss a unit like this without acknowledging that uncomfortable historical reality. The organization had been designed, among other purposes, to create a particular type of soldier shaped from adolescence toward obedience and martial values. And yet, and this is where historical truth becomes complex and requires careful holding, the men themselves, in their individual moments, were not concepts or abstractions. They were young, they were tired, they were frightened, they wanted to live and to go home, and they were capable of small kindnesses and ordinary human decency even within a system designed for something else entirely. History does not make this comfortable, nor should it. Both things are true at once. The system was what it was, and the men were what they were. By 19 hours, as the full dark settled, most of the digging had been completed. The Panzergrenadiers had established a reasonably defensible position, 3 separate squad areas arranged with overlapping fields of fire, a machine gun nest positioned to rake the approach from the east, runners and messengers established to maintain contact with the platoon command post in a slightly deeper section of the lane. It was work they had done before, many times, and they did it with the efficiency of long practice but without passion. This was simply what one did after a day of fighting and withdrawal. This was how you survived the night. Food, when it came, was modest. The supply lorries had made it forward an hour before dark, and each man received a tin of meat, some biscuits that were hard enough to require actual effort to chew, a small ration of schnapps in a metal cup. The warmth of the schnapps was perhaps valued more than the alcohol itself. It provided a moment of something other than cold and fear. The tinned meat was of unknown composition, having the peculiar taste that all tinned meat seems to have in the dark, and the men ate mechanically, without discussion, the way animals eat when food is placed before them. One man, older than the others, perhaps 35, with the bearing of someone who had seen service before this present war, finished his ration and lit another cigarette, the 3rd or 4th of the evening. When you have nothing else to do, smoking fills time and provides small rituals of control in circumstances that offer very little control. He spoke to no one in particular, simply stated as fact into the darkness. We cannot hold here, not if they press us, not with what we have. No one responded, because no one disagreed, and there was no value in discussing what everyone already knew. The reinforcements had not come. The Panther support had been pulled back toward division reserves. The ammunition situation was growing tighter every day. Somewhere in the darkness, orders were being written and rewritten, strategies adjusted to accommodate the reality that the Normandy campaign was not proceeding according to plan. But knowledge of that strategy, if such men possessed it at all, was fragmentary and indirect, arriving through the fog of command and the delays of communication. What they knew, with certainty, was the immediate. They would hold this position through the night if nothing pressed them, and they would hold it through the morning if they were given the order to do so, and they would probably not hold it forever because nothing was forever in warfare. This acceptance, this understanding, creates a particular psychological state that is not quite despair and not quite peace, but something in between, a kind of calm that comes from having surrendered to events, from accepting that your will and your wishes are peripheral to the movement of larger forces. By 2000 hours, the sentries had been posted, the night watch established, and the remainder of the men had settled into their positions to attempt rest. In the bocage, you did not sleep restfully, not in the way sleep happens in normal circumstances. You dozed, you startled awake at sounds, you lay alert and half-conscious for hours, your nervous system attuned to the possibility of sudden violence. Some men managed to lie down on the earth, using their packs as pillows, trying to reclaim some small measure of rest before the next phase of whatever would come. Others sat, eyes open in the darkness, smoking or thinking, or trying very hard not to think at all. The quiet talk, the small conversations, began to peter out as the night deepened. There was nothing more to say, really. Tomorrow would come, and it would bring what it brought, and they would do what they had learned tame. As the light drains from the Norman sky that evening, the exhaustion which has been gathering in the bodies of these men all day begins to settle more heavily into their bones. The hedgerows grow darker, lose definition, blend into shadow. Company officers move quietly through the positions, speaking in low voices about watch rotation, ammunition counts, and the placement of the night sentries, who will sit alone in the darkness. There is a particular kind of fatigue that comes after a day of constant alertness, not merely the tiredness of physical exertion, but the deeper weariness that follows prolonged fear, the kind that sits behind the eyes and makes even breathing feel labored. Around 2000 hours, as full darkness settles over the bocage and the first stars emerge in patches between the cloud cover, small groups of men begin their movement toward the listening posts. These are positions established perhaps 50 or 80 meters forward of the main line, often in a sunken lane or behind a particularly dense thicket, places where a soldier or pair of soldiers will sit through the night with rifles across their laps, ears attuned to every rustle and distant sound. The men selected for these duties move with a particular care, stepping slowly, feeling the ground before they place their weight, avoiding the snap of dry branches. One imagines that the nerves are very present in these moments, that the imagination populates the darkness with threats both real and imagined. The listening posts themselves are uncomfortable stations. There is no real shelter, no warmth beyond what a greatcoat and perhaps a shared blanket might provide. The men sit in pairs usually, taking turns resting their eyes, though sleep comes rarely and never deeply. Conversation is whispered or foregone entirely. Instead, there is the sound of the night itself, the wind moving through the apple and pear trees, the distant call of an owl, and underneath it all, that low rumble which has become so constant over the past weeks that it has almost faded into the background of consciousness. That sound is the artillery. Somewhere beyond the horizon, in positions held by German batteries, or perhaps those of the Germans' allies, guns are firing, and that distant percussion echoes across the landscape in a rhythm that is almost like a heartbeat, steady and somewhat reassuring in its predictability, though the men would hesitate to say so. The artillery fire this evening, as documented in various unit records that historians have since examined, seems to follow a pattern. Waves of it arrive from the north and northwest, likely British or Canadian guns providing harassment fire, the sort of thing designed not to do massive damage, but to keep defenders alert and unable to rest, to wear away at morale through sheer repetition. The flashes are sometimes visible from the listening posts, a distant orange glow that illuminates the clouds from beneath, and momentarily turns the night into something resembling dusk, though a dusk that is wrong, inverted, unnatural. How must it feel, one wonders, to be young, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, sitting in the cold darkness with a rifle you have held so many times today that it feels like an extension of your arms, knowing that the sound you are hearing at this moment might be a prelude to something far worse. The waiting is perhaps more exhausting than the actual fighting. Back in the main defensive line, the soldiers who are not on sentinel duty are attempting to rest. The farmhouse and the scattered trenches and foxholes have taken on a different character Now that darkness has fallen, they are more cramped, more claustrophobic somehow, despite being open to the sky. Men huddle in small groups, wrapped in blankets or greatcoats, some trying to write letters home by the dim light of shielded candles, though the paper is damp from the ever-present moisture of the Norman countryside, and the pen moves reluctantly across the fibres. The letters that survive from this period, preserved in archives and museums, handled carefully by researchers decades later, often repeat similar themes. There are requests for news from home, expressions of longing for family, mentions of the food one is missing, quiet observations about comrades who are no longer present to receive letters. One soldier writes about the weather, another mentions that his socks are perpetually wet and that he cannot remember what it feels like to be warm. These are the small details that anchor the vast historical moment to something human and intimate and understandable. A few men sleep despite the conditions, and they sleep the sleep of the utterly exhausted, the kind of sleep that has nothing restful about it, that is more like a brief shutting down of consciousness than genuine rest. Their dreams, insofar as we can guess at them from the fragmentary accounts that exist, seem to have been troubled. One account mentions a soldier waking suddenly, reaching for his weapon before remembering where he was. Another notes that the men often called out in their sleep, murmured words in their native dialect or in German, names of people far away. The mind, even in sleep, does not release its grip on the immediate reality of danger. The night deepens. Around 2200 hours, there is a brief moment of alarm, a sound from one of the listening posts, perhaps the snap of a branch, perhaps an animal moving through the undergrowth. Word passes back through the line. Men come alert, hands move to weapons, but nothing materializes from the darkness. The anxiety settles slowly. The tension does not fully dissipate, but becomes merely chronic again, rather than acute. This happens several times through the night. Small scares, false alarms, the nervous system kept perpetually strung tight by the knowledge that an attack could come at any moment, that the darkness is not empty, but is full of the enemy's presence, even if that presence is not, for the moment, making itself known. As the night moves deeper, toward the hours just after midnight, the artillery fire seems to intensify briefly, perhaps an adjustment in targeting, perhaps simply a shift in strategy on the part of whoever is directing the bombardment. The flashes come closer together now, the sound less muffled, less distant. In the listening posts, the men press themselves lower, though there is nowhere really to go, nothing to hide behind, except the slight depression of the sunken lane, and their own willingness to become small, invisible. How long must those hours feel? Time moves differently when one is afraid and tired and cold. An hour might be experienced as 3 hours might pass like 1. And yet eventually, as must happen with all nights, the tempo of the artillery begins to decrease. Perhaps by coincidence, perhaps by design, the bombardment that has characterized the evening lightens, the intervals between explosions grow longer, the darkness becomes quieter again, and in that quietness, there is an almost unexpected mercy. It is past midnight now, well into the deepest part of the night. The men in the listening posts are experiencing a particular kind of exhaustion. They have been awake for many hours, through a day of intense activity and intermittent combat and constant vigilance. Their eyes are heavy. Their thoughts have taken on that quality of dreamlike haziness that precedes sleep, though they dare not surrender to it fully. In the main line, the soldiers who have been trying to rest are now truly sleeping, though the sleep is thin and unreliable. Bodies are arranged on cold ground, heads on boots or on the packs that serve as pillows. The sounds of the night, both the natural sounds and the distant remnants of war, have become almost a lullaby through repetition and sheer exhaustion. The mind ceases to jolt at the distant rumble of artillery. Instead, it becomes part of the fabric of existence, something to sleep through rather than around. There is a particular mercy, perhaps, in this kind of sleep, the sleep of soldiers in the line during wartime, the sleep that comes not from peaceful rest, but from the absolute exhaustion of the nervous system, from a body that simply cannot maintain alertness any longer, from a mind that has retreated as far from consciousness as it can, without actually surrendering the vigilance that keeps a soldier alive. Some of these men, by historical record, would continue this cycle for weeks more. Others would not see another sunrise in this position. But for now, in this moment, as the hours press toward 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, as the listening posts maintain their quiet vigil and the main defensive line settles into an uneasy rest, there is only the slow unwinding, the gradual release of tension that comes when the body finally insists on its needs, regardless of the mind's continued anxiety. The wind moves through the Norman hedgerows, the distant artillery continues its slow, irregular pulse, and in the darkness, young men, some sleeping, some keeping watch, all of them carrying the weight of a day that has tested them in ways they could barely have imagined when they woke to that grey dawn so many hours before, are enduring, surviving, waiting for whatever the next day will bring. They do not know what form that day will take. They do not know whether they will see another dusk. They only know that they must rest, somehow, despite everything that makes rest seem impossible. And so they do, their sleep the sleep of the young and the exhausted, their dreams perhaps offering brief moments of the homes and lives that feel increasingly distant, increasingly dreamlike themselves, seen through the fog of time and circumstance and war. The fields of Normandy fall quiet now, and in that quietness, after nearly 80 years of cultivation and rebuilding, the bocage has become something other than it was. The sunken lanes still wind between hedgerows, yes, but they carry tractors instead of half-tracks now, and the wheel ruts fill with rain, rather than the treads of armoured vehicles grinding deeper into the chalk and clay. The farmhouses have been repaired, their roofs are whole again. Windows that were blown out by shell fire in June of 1944 have been replaced and replaced again, and the families who own them now, great-grandchildren and descendants of those who sheltered in cellars or fled inland, they walk across fields that somehow must feel both ordinary and haunted, as if the ground itself remembers what happened there, even as grass and grain and life obscure it. If one were to stand in those fields today, on a morning much like the morning when this particular Panzergrenadier company woke in darkness to the rumble of distant guns, one would see almost no trace of that day. The military cemeteries remain, of course, carefully maintained, marked with crosses and stars of David and plaques in a dozen languages. But the temporary positions, the hasty entrenchments, the shell holes and wire, and the scattered equipment that lay in the bocage in the summer of 1944, all of that has been absorbed back into the earth. The foxholes have filled in. The ammunition boxes have long since rotted away or been scavenged by farmers clearing their land. Nature moves quickly when left to itself, and even human catastrophe, when it is concentrated into weeks and months rather than years, can be covered over remarkably fast. And yet there are people who remember, not many now. The men who wore those uniforms, on either side, are themselves mostly gone, or very old, their voices growing quieter each year, but their sons and daughters remember the stories. Their grandchildren have sometimes visited these fields with a kind of deliberate pilgrimage, searching for the exact place their grandfather took cover, or where their grandmother watched tanks move past her village, or where a distant uncle was killed and buried in a mass grave before being moved to a proper cemetery much later. It is a strange thing, this tourism of tragedy, this walking of ground that was contested and blood-soaked, looking for traces of the past in a landscape that has worked so hard to forget. The historians, though, they have not forgotten. In archives in Berlin and London and Ottawa and Moscow, in private collections and museum basements, there are photographs and letters and after-action reports and casualty lists that document what happened in the bocage, hour by hour and day by day, through the summer of 1944. Some of these documents came from the men themselves, soldiers who survived and wrote their stories down decades later, when the weight of silence had become too much to carry. Others come from the official record, the dry reports filed by regimental commanders and medics and supply officers, who were simply doing their jobs, unaware that what they wrote would become part of the historical tapestry. What strikes a reader, an observer, a student of that period, is how much of the Normandy campaign was like this: small units holding ground, small units being pushed back, small units reinforced, and learning to work together as a mechanism that was partly human and partly machine. The Panzergrenadiers, like the infantrymen opposing them, were caught in a kind of mechanical process, a slow grinding of one armed force against another, with terrain and weather and supply lines and the will of distant commanders all working to determine who would hold, who would retreat, who would live, and who would not. The battle for the Bocage was not dramatic in the sense of history books with large arrows and grand strategy. It was dramatic in small, repeated, infinitely sad ways. A squad learning to move efficiently from one hedgerow to another, a medic running across open ground toward a man who had fallen, a soldier writing a letter to his wife knowing that he might not live to send it. If one were to visit the area today, in the present moment, one could walk the same paths that this Panzergrenadier company walked on that June day in 1944. One could stand where the half-tracks would have been positioned, look out across the same fields that the sentries watched, listen for sounds that no longer come. The orchards are still there, some of them at least, though some have been cleared for more efficient farming, and others have grown older and more gnarled with time. The farmhouses remain, sometimes still occupied by farmers who worked the same land their families worked in 1944, or by new people drawn to the region by what it offers now, a kind of melancholic beauty, a landscape scarred by history, but not broken by it. There is a particular kind of peace that settles over a battlefield after enough time has passed. It is not the peace of forgetting, because the landscape itself, the contours, the layout, the way sound carries across open ground, remains marked by what happened there. It is more like the peace of acceptance, the understanding that terrible things happened here, that people suffered and died here, that this ground absorbed more weight and anguish than most places on earth have to carry, and yet the seasons turned anyway, the crops grew, the children were born, and somehow, in a way that is both mysterious and ordinary, the world moved on. The Panzergrenadier, who made it out of the Bocage alive, and some did, carrying their memories forward into a new Germany, a defeated and divided Germany, a Germany that had to reckon with what had been done in its name. Those men lived into old age, many of them. They had grandchildren who would never hear gunfire in anger. They had moments of peace, presumably, moments of ordinary happiness, moments when what they had seen in Normandy receded to the background, though it probably never fully disappeared. The same was true for the Allied soldiers who survived, British and Canadian and American infantrymen who pushed back against positions like the one held by this particular company, who suffered casualties and learned to move through the Bocage with increasing efficiency, who eventually helped to break out of the beachhead and drive inland toward Germany itself. What happens in the very long arc of history is that individual days, even days as significant and consequential as June 6th and June 7th and the days that followed, become part of a larger pattern. They matter enormously in the moment, and they matter in the long reckoning of how the war unfolded and who survived to tell its story. But they also, in a way, become smaller as time passes. They become part of a much larger narrative, the history of the Second World War, the history of the 20th century, the history of Europe after the war, the history of soldiers and combat, and what it means to ask ordinary human beings to endure extraordinary things. Standing in the Bocage today, one might try to imagine what it sounded like then. The crack of rifle fire, the deep thump of mortars, the higher whine of shells passing overhead, the shouts of officers and non-commissioned officers calling out commands, the groans of wounded men, the weight of exhaustion and fear and the strange hyper-alertness that combat brings, the smell of cordite and churned earth, and the particular stench of an unwashed man who has been wearing the same clothes for 3 days. All of it is gone now. There is only wind through the hedgerows, birdsong, the distant sound of machinery on a road somewhere, the ordinary silence of a summer day. And yet, if one knows what to listen for, if one brings to the landscape the knowledge of what happened there, it is possible to hear an echo. Not an actual echo, that is not what this is, but something more like a kind of resonance, a sense that this place has been marked, that it holds within it the memory of what transpired. Soldiers who have visited the area decades after the war often report feeling something of this kind. They walk across the same ground where they sheltered as young men, and they find themselves overwhelmed by the sensation of time compressed, of all the years that have passed since then, and all the changes that have taken place, seeming somehow to collapse back into a single moment. This is what the bocage offers to a visitor now. It is a landscape of memory, held in the earth, and the stones and the old trees that were saplings in 1944. It is a place where the quiet that came after the battle is still profound, not because anything is specially preserved or protected, but simply because enough time has passed that the new has grown over the old, and the ordinary rhythms of farming and living and dying have reasserted themselves over the extraordinary rhythms of warfare. The blood has long since been washed into the soil. The bodies have been buried and moved and honored according to the customs of different nations. The machines have been salvaged, melted down, turned into new machines.